Picture this. You stumble out of a cold stone chamber at dawn, the smell of burnt tallow and stale lavender hanging heavy in the air, and the village women stare at you like you just failed a medieval beauty audition. Hey guys, if that mental image gave you a shiver, smash that like button and drop a comment telling us which medieval beauty horror would haunt your Instagram feed. Before we dive into the gruesome grooming rituals that would make modern selfies look like child's play, dim the lights, grab a blanket, and maybe keep a cup of tea handy. You'll feel the rough scrape of a wooden comb edged with iron. Hear the clatter of gauntlet-clad hands trimming hair with knives sharper than your Monday deadline, and taste the bitter tang of lead-based cosmetics as they dry on your cheek. It's the kind of beauty regime that would turn a TikTok challenge into a medieval torture test. Think no filter, taken literally, with a side of snake oil and a dash of sarcasm. The Great Hall of King Charles V swarmed like a beehive of silk and sighs, torchlight flickering against tapestries that smelled of wax and wet stone. Young Lady Elinor slipped between courtiers, her mind humming with a different tune. A wedding feast, a husband's hand, a bed of rose-laden linens. The clatter of horse hooves on cobblestones outside mingled with the soft rustle of linen skirts, painting a soundtrack of anticipation. Yet every glance at the mirrored armor reflected not just her own hopeful face, but the looming shadow of a new royal edict. In a dim corner, Master Rowan, the barber surgeon with a razor grin and a pouch of leeches, leaned close enough to taste the perfume of Elinor's rose water. He whispered about the king's latest decree: skin as pale as parchment, hair shaved to the crown like a freshly shaven head of a monk, and a corset so tight it could double as a siege weapon. The words scraped against the air like a scalpel, slicing through the court's usual chatter. Rowan's voice crackled with the same excitement a modern influencer shows when unveiling a new, absurd beauty trend. Ladies of the court gasped, their giggles turning to whines as they imagined the cold sting of hair being pulled from roots, the ache of bone-crushing laces hugging their waists. Servants shuffled about, the scent of hot iron and boiled herbs filling the corridors as they prepared for a day of forced transformations. One noblewoman, draped in emerald velour, muttered that looking like a corpse was the new chic, while another muttered, "I'd rather wrestle a dragon than wear that thing." The irony hung heavy. A kingdom that prized chivalry now demanded its women become living mannequins. Elinor felt a knot tighten in her stomach, tighter than any corset could possibly bind. She imagined herself on a stage, a medieval version of a reality show where the judges were kings and the prize was survival, not a rose. The sound of her own heartbeat matched the frantic thrum of a lute, each beat a reminder that this was no mere fashion. Her very flesh was at stake. Still, a spark of rebellion flickered. She glanced at Rowan, whose eyes gleamed like polished steel, wondering if the barber surgeon could be coaxed into a cut and run operation. As the royal herald bellowed the decree from the balcony, the courtyard erupted in a chorus of clanking metal and muffled curses. Women huddled, whispering strategies beneath the scent of burning tallow, while masters of the blade sharpened their tools with a grin that said, "I'm here for the drama." Elinor, clutching a hidden ribbon of silk, made a silent vow to turn the king's grotesque beauty rule into his own downfall. The stage was set, the mirrors ready, and the court would soon learn whether beauty truly kills, or if a clever lady can rewrite the script. Dawn cracked over the stone courtyard like a cracked egg, and Elinor was already perched on a cold iron stool, a rag of lead powder clutched in her trembling hand. The apothecary's apprentice dumped a glittering, metallic dust onto her cheek, the smell of wet pennies searing her nostrils as the powder sank like a grim moisturizer. Each swipe of the coarse cloth felt like a medieval exfoliant made for dragons, scraping away any hint of a youthful glow. The court's whispers turned into a chorus of muttered prayers for the king's health, while the powder left her skin the color of a freshly squeezed beet, an aesthetic that would make any Instagram filter jealous. Irony dripped from the rafters. The very lead meant to preserve beauty was slowly turning her skin into a living cautionary tale about toxicity. A plot twist even a Game of Thrones writer would applaud. When the powder dried, the maidens ushered in the next torture. Hair removal with a hot iron called the scarlet razor, its hiss echoing like a dragon's sigh. Elinor's arms trembled as the blade glided over her forearms, searing the flesh with a sensation that was part searing, part fireworks, and all very unwanted. The sound of other women's sighs rose in a grim chorus, each gasp a badge of loyalty to a king who measured devotion in the smoothness of his subjects' arms. The palace air grew thick with the coppery tang of burnt hair and the faint perfume of lavender, an olfactory joke that the scent was meant to mask the sting, not the misery. Even the court jester tried to lighten the mood, joking that the next fashion trend would be no hair, no problem. But his punchline fell flatter than a damp parchment. After the ritual, the dining hall offered a banquet of boiled herbs, a menu that could only be described as green soup meets swamp water. The broth bubbled sluggishly, releasing the earthy smell of nettles, dandelion roots, and a whisper of rosemary that tried desperately to masquerade as a culinary delight. Elinor ladled the viscous liquid into her mouth, feeling the grit of roots scrape her tongue like sandpaper on a medieval chalkboard. The other ladies sipped with forced smiles, their eyes darting toward the kitchen doorway as if a pizza delivery service might rescue them from this vegetal purgatory. A sudden rustle of parchment announced a new royal edict. "Thine waist shall be as thin as the king's patience," a phrase that would make even a modern health influencer cringe. Within the marble corridors, the court's ladies turned the torture chamber into a runway, each scar a glittering medal of devotion displayed like a medieval Instagram story. They whispered about the king's latest tryst with a traveling minstrel, trading gossip as if it were silk, while their fingers brushed the newly smooth skin of one another, comparing whose lead powder blush lasted longest. The ambience was thick with envy, rivalry, and the faint clink of armor as footmen shuffled past, their boots echoing like a metronome counting down each woman's chance at royal favor. A sudden burst of laughter erupted when one lady tried to hide a fresh scar under a veil, only for the king's favorite hound to sniff it out, proving that even dogs were better at reading the room than most courtiers. In that moment, the irony was as sharp as the razor. The very rituals meant to polish their images were carving deeper pits of jealousy beneath the gilded surface. Elinor, however, kept a secret rebellion tucked beneath the folds of her linen, tiny notes scribbled in charcoal, each a sigh of dissent against the crimson regime. She would slip them into the herb broth, letting the bitter taste carry her whispered protests like a covert code only the pantry rats could decode. The occasional chuckle from a passing servant hinted at a shared camaraderie, a covert network of those who found the king's beauty standards as absurd as a medieval meme. When the king entered the hall, his gaze sweeping over the smooth arms like a judge at a talent show, Elinor lifted her chin, feeling the faint sting of lead and the fierce pulse of defiance. In that brief instant, her scarred soul shone brighter than any powder-bleached cheek, proving that even in a world obsessed with superficial perfection, the human spirit could still flicker like a candle in a wind-blown cathedral. In the candle-swept gloom of St. Marek's chapel, Elinor slipped a lace-trimmed handkerchief into the cracked stone alcove, signaling the start of the clandestine council. Rowan, whose scarred hands once forged battle axes, lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that made the ancient frescoes seem to lean in. Around them gathered a handful of nobles with gaudy cloaks stained by blood wine, each clutching a parchment that listed the kingdom's grotesque beauty mandates, like the mandatory 6-hour fasting before a courtly feast. The air smelled of incense and damp moss, mingling with the metallic tang of fear. Even the stone seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls knew they were about to betray their sovereign's vanity. They plotted to expose the deadly standards that forced maidens to trim their hair with razors, and to swallow honey-scented poultices that turned their throats into rattling cages. Elinor sketched a caricature of the Queen's golden mask, a grotesque grin that would make a modern meme go viral in the tavern. Rowan suggested releasing the list of forbidden cosmetics at the upcoming midsummer tournament, where knights strutted like peacocks in polished armor that clanked louder than a heavy metal concert. The dissenters giggled, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceiling like a mischievous choir of gargoyles. Yet every chuckle was laced with the iron taste of impending peril, for they knew the king's spymaster listened to gossip like a raven to a midnight drum. Enter Lady Vivienne, whose jealousy burned brighter than the chapel's guttering candles. She coveted Rowan's favor and despised Elinor's daring smile. She slipped out of the shadows, her silk shoes clicking against the cold floor, and slipped a sealed note to the royal steward, detailing the conspirators' secret rendezvous. The note arrived wrapped in a fragrant rose, the scent of which clung to the steward's nostrils like a warning incense. By dawn, the royal guard stormed the chapel, their armor clanking like a marching band in a funeral procession. The shocked nobles froze, their faces flushing red as freshly painted banners, while the steward's quills scratched a terse decree on the town's notice board. The punishment was a public spectacle, staged on the stone square where the market's chatter usually danced with the smell of fresh bread. Elinor was forced to stand on a wooden platform, her hands bound with cords soaked in the same bitter herbal tincture that once beautified the queen, now repurposed as a torture device that made her skin crawl. Rowan watched, his heart hammering louder than a war drum, as a troop of drummers beat a rhythm that sounded like a dying horse's hooves. The crowd jeered, their voices a cacophony of glee and disgust, while the town crier shouted a chilling warning. "Defy the crown's beauty, and you shall taste the very ground you walk upon." The sun set, casting long shadows that stretched like skeletal fingers across the cobblestones. Even as the flames of the torches flickered, a low murmur rose from the corners of the square, whispers of defiance that refused to be snuffed out. Elinor, bruised but unbroken, managed a cracked smile that reminded onlookers of a meme face, half hopeful, half sarcastic. Rowan, though shackled, whispered a promise to his comrades that the next rebellion would be as inevitable as a sequel to a blockbuster franchise. The jealous lady, Vivienne, smirked, thinking she had won. Yet she could not hear the soft rustle of parchment being hidden in the chapel's secret alcove, waiting for the next act. And so the tale of the brutal medieval beauty standards lingered, a grotesque legend told in hushed tones, like the bedtime story that keeps you awake. The royal tournament unfurled like a chaotic circus, banners snapping in the wind and trumpets blaring louder than a 2020s rave. King Aldrich, swaddled in a velvet cloak that smelled of pine resin and old money, barked an edict that made the squires wince, a public parade of the court's perfect women. He imagined a tableau as polished as a knight's armor, the kind of spectacle that would make even a medieval TikTok go viral. The courtyard swarmed with peasants, merchants, and drunk minstrels, all buzzing like bees around a honey-sweet promise of spectacle. When the king's herald shouted Elinor's name, the crowd peeled back their heads like startled geese. She stumbled onto the dais, skin a cracked parchment from relentless bleaching, so white it reflected the sun like a cracked mirror. Her hair, once a river of gold, now sat in a barren crown of sparse, straw-like strands, daring the sun to find a shade. The scent of burnt wax and chalk drifted around her, a fragrant reminder of the cruel alchemy that turned beauty into a public experiment. A collective gasp rose from the audience, half awe, half horror, as if they'd just witnessed a royal version of a reality show confession. Elinor lifted her cracked lips, voice trembling like a lute string, and shouted, "Your perfection is a poison, a cruel edict that strips us of flesh and spirit." Her words cracked the veneer of the king's court, echoing through the stone arches louder than a dragon's roar. Irony dripped from her declaration. She was the very embodiment of the absurd standards she condemned, like a medieval meme gone tragically literal. The murmurs erupted into a roar of anger, fists slammed against shields, and the scent of spilled ale mixed with the metallic tang of hastily drawn swords. Knights lunged forward, half to protect the king, half to quell the uprising, their armor clanking like a chorus of angry tin cans. Women in silk gowns whispered conspiracies, their eyes glittering with a mix of fear and fierce solidarity. The courtyard became a battlefield of ideology, where the fight for beauty turned into a literal fight for life, each shout reverberating like a war drum in a feudal rap battle. When the dust settled, the king sat on his throne, his crown askew, looking like a bewildered cat that had just been thrown into a room full of laser pointers. Elinor, bruised but unbowed, slipped away into the shadowed corridors, her silhouette a rebel flag against the drab stone walls. The court's whispers lingered, promising that the next decree would be less about porcelain faces and more about the grit under the nails. And somewhere, a minstrel began humming a new ballad, one that would be sung in taverns for years, reminding everyone that true beauty is as unruly and fierce as a runaway horse on a moonlit night. When the first cough rolled out of the market stalls like a bad whiff of sour butter, the kingdom's glittering beauty contests froze faster than a tavern's ale in a winter freeze. The once bright banners draped over the arena sagged, heavy with the smell of rot and damp wool, as whispers of the pestilence crept through the corridors. King Aldrich, who had once judged maidens on the length of their lashes and the sheen of their hair, clutched his jeweled goblet as if the wine could ward off death. Courtiers tried to hide their panic behind forced chuckles, but the sound of coughing echoing off stone walls was louder than any lute. In that moment, the kingdom's obsession with hollow beauty was forced into a silent, uneasy truce with mortality. The king retreated to his chambers, where candlelight flickered against tapestries depicting mythic queens, each more flawless than a Photoshop filter. He stared at the scarred faces of his physicians, the air thick with incense trying to mask the metallic tang of blood, and wondered if his cruel rules were more a joke than a decree. With a sigh that rattled his crown, Aldrich ordered the judge's blades, those cruel instruments that measured cheekbones with knives, to be sheathed, like a weapon left idle after a showdown in a Marvel movie. The court stone floors, once polished to mirror shine, now echoed the soft thuds of worn boots, a reminder that even monarchs must bow to the grim reaper's timetable. Ironically, the kingdom's most brutal standards were abandoned quieter than a secret Snapchat streak disappearing. Elinor, the once favored contestant whose skin bore the gold-leafed markings of the king's vanity, survived the plague with a complexion marred by feverish rashes and a jagged scar across her cheek. The scar, a bright slash of crimson against pale flesh, smelled faintly of burnt resin each time she brushed her hand over it, a tactile reminder of the battle she'd endured. Yet rather than hide it, she wore it like a badge, her laughter ringing louder than the coughing crowds, turning the wound into a rallying flag for those who'd grown tired of perfection. People began to whisper that her scar glittered like the lightsaber of a certain space-faring Jedi, cutting through the darkness of oppression. In taverns, songs rose about Elinor's resilience, and the clink of mugs echoed the rhythm of a new, grittier beauty. Gradually, the court's atmosphere softened. The once stifling perfume of rosewater was replaced by the earthy scent of fresh bread and pine needles, symbols of a more humane kingdom. Courtiers swapped cruel critiques for genuine compliments, noting the strength in a calloused hand or the kindness in a warm smile, as if they were rating characters on a reality TV show where vulnerability earned points. King Aldrich, now pale but wiser, announced that future contests would celebrate the spirit that survives the night, a phrase that smelled oddly like burnt sage and hope. The old brutal rules lay in a dusty cupboard, their metal edges dulled like an obsolete gaming controller, forgotten by those who once wielded them. The memory of Elian's defiance lingered, a ghostly echo that turned the palace halls from a catwalk into a cathedral of lived experience. Years later, when a minstrel strummed a lute and sang of the plague that turned a kingdom's vanity on its head, listeners laughed and cried in equal measure, their eyes glistening like the wet cobblestones after a rainstorm. The story became a cautionary tale, whispered to children who dared to obsess over flawless skin, reminding them that true beauty can be as messy as a battlefield in Game of Thrones, but far less dramatic in costuming. Even the king's portrait was repainted, now showing him with a slightly crooked grin and a faint smudge of ink on his cheek, as if he'd just survived a terrible meme. The court, once a runway of cruelty, blossomed into a garden where scarred roses grew beside pristine lilies, each scent mingling in a fragrant rebellion against the past. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the palace, Elinor's scar still glowed, a stubborn reminder that sometimes the most brutal rules break themselves without a single sword swing. The bell of St. Giles rang like a gossiping town crier, rattling the cobblestones of Brackenford as merchants hawked their wares, and chickens strutted through the market square. The summer air smelled of fresh bread, horse sweat, and a hint of river mud that clung to the villagers' boots. In the shadow of the stone keep, Master Aldrich the barber polished his brass scissors, their edges catching the sun like a pirate's cutlass. A courier, breathless and ink-stained, slipped a sealed parchment into Aldrich's hand, the wax seal bearing the Lord's crimson sigil. Aldrich's scarred forearms trembled as the decree unfurled, announcing the grim grooming law. The grim grooming law was as severe as a winter famine, dictating who could wield a razor and how much hair could be sheared without triggering the town's wrath. Only licensed barbers, those who had sworn fealty to the Lord and paid the annual hair tax, were permitted to trim crowns, while peasants were forbidden to prune beyond a 3-inch length, lest they be accused of vanity. Violators faced penalties ranging from a public flogging with a broomstick to, according to rumor, having their heads shaved bald as a symbol of disgrace. The parchment listed iron-clad clauses, each clause heavier than a sack of grain, and it demanded that every citizen report illegal cuts within a day's notice. In the cramped backroom of Aldrich's shop, the law smelled of iron, ink, and the faint sourness of fear. Aldrich, a wiry man with a mane of tangled black hair, stared at the decree like a knight reading a dragon's contract, part dread, part curiosity. Beside him stood his apprentice, young Tomas, whose curls bounced like springtime nettles and who secretly dreamed of starring in a medieval hair rock band. Across the square, Lord Bramwell, a rotund noble with a perfectly trimmed goatee, paced his courtyard, his boots clacking against the flagstones as he plotted how to turn the law into his personal fashion police. The townspeople shuffled, eyes darting between the barber's shop and the Lord's balcony, their whispers tasting like stale ale. Even the town's stray dogs seemed to sniff out the tension, wagging their tails in anticipation of a hair-raising spectacle. When Aldrich finally opened his shop's battered door, the scent of hot tallow and clotted blood flooded the room, a reminder that a shave could be as brutal as a battlefield. He called the first defiant client, a burly miller with a beard that could hide a rabbit, to sit, his chair creaking like a medieval soundtrack. With a swift snip, Aldrich trimmed the miller's scalp to the prescribed 3 inches, the fallen strands scattering like confetti at a feast, while the miller muttered curses that smelled of stale cheese. Outside, a brass drum beat as the town watch gathered, their faces a patchwork of curiosity and dread, while Lord Bramwell watched from his balcony, finger drumming like a metronome of authority. The whole scene felt like a twisted episode of Game of Thrones meets a Saturday morning cartoon, absurd yet terrifyingly real. By dusk, the street lamps flickered on, casting long shadows that made Aldrich's scissors glint like tiny swords in a medieval music video. The townsfolk whispered that the law would soon be known as the Barber's Decree, a nickname that stuck faster than a fresh wax seal. Tomas, still sporting his rebellious curls, plotted to start an underground hair-cutting club, promising members secret styles that would make the Lord's goatee look like a toddler's doodle. Aldrich, wiping his forehead with a cloth stained in ink and sweat, smiled wryly, realizing that in a world of iron and parchment, a good haircut could be the most subversive act of all. And so, the grim grooming law marched on, hairless heads bobbing in the moonlight, while the town's gossip mill churned louder than any medieval gossip column. When the bell tolled the 5th time on market day, The villagers of Thistledown slipped their woolen cloaks tighter and shuffled toward the ancient oak, the only place where the town constable's eyes could not follow. The grim grooming laws, ironclad edicts that find any soul caught with an uneven braid or an unwashed forehead, had turned the simple act of a haircut into a public spectacle worthy of the gallows. Whispers rustled like moths in the night, and the smell of damp pine mingled with the sour perfume of sweat-soaked shirts that no one dared to wash in daylight. Even the village fool, Jorik, tried to hide his new buzz cut behind a sack of potatoes, only to be shamed with a wooden sign proclaiming, "Look, a rebel without a razor." But the oak's hollow offered a hush, and the crowd gathered, eyes bright with the thrill of forbidden grooming. In the shadows of the oak, old Marta whispered the tale of the silken snip, a clandestine technique passed down from a traveling barber who vanished like a magician's rabbit. She described how a trembling apprentice would drag a rusted nail, sharpened on a stone by moonlight, through a lock of hair, the sound like a tiny violin string breaking. The cut was hidden beneath a tangled hat, and the victim would strut home feeling the breeze on a scalp as smooth as polished pewter. The village children giggled, picturing their father's toupees flopping like overcooked pancakes whenever a sudden gust blew. Each whispered snip carried the scent of cut hair, a metallic tang that lingered longer than the law's stale parchment. Beside the oak, a burbling brook became the covert washing station, its water as cold as a witch's stare, but just as effective at erasing the stench of week-long toil. Elspeth's mother would slip a bucket of river water into the kitchen, add a handful of crushed rosemary and a pinch of ash, and scrub the family's backs with a wooden brush that sang like a creaking floorboard. Those who dared to wash themselves in secret whispered prayers to a forgotten saint of soap, hoping the suds would mask their scent from the tax collector's snout. The steam rose like ghostly ribbons, curling around the thatched roofs, while the earthy aroma of wet moss made the air taste of damp crayons. One night, a daring lad named Pippin attempted a full-body lather, emerging looking like a medieval spa commercial, only to be chased by the night watch with a broom as if it were a giant feather duster. While the others swapped stories, Elspeth, still polishing a chipped copper cauldron, spied a half-buried manuscript beneath a moss-clad stone. Its vellum crackled like dried leaves, and the ink, though faded, spelled out the charter of cleanliness, an ancient decree granting every free soul the right to wash their hands, hair, and conscience. She turned each page with the delicacy of a cat burglar, discovering clauses that spoke of baths as sacred as baptism and scissors as tools of liberty, not oppression. A grin spread across her face as the words tickled her imagination, making her feel like a Renaissance version of Hermione Granger discovering a forbidden spellbook. She tucked the manuscript into her apron, her heart thudding like a drum in a tavern troupe, ready to weaponize the forgotten law against the tyrannical grooming edicts. Word of Elspeth's find rippled through the hidden circle like a mischievous spark, igniting a covert campaign that would soon be known as the Clean Rebellion. Villagers began to flaunt tiny, scented sachets in their pockets, a fragrant reminder that the law could not govern a whiff of lavender. In the moonlit hours, they practiced secret haircuts under the oak, each snip echoing like a drumbeat of defiance, while the river sang a lullaby of suds and liberty. Even the stern constable, caught in a sudden downpour, slipped on a soapy stone and fell, his red badge of authority sliding into the mud as he muttered, "Well, That's a hair-raising turn of events. By the time the next decree tried to clamp down harder, the villagers were already chanting, "Give us our combs! Give us our baths!" A chorus that rattled the stone walls of the town hall and promised that no law could ever truly shave off the human spirit. The moon hung low like a tarnished coin over the cobblestones of Brackenwick, casting silver slivers onto the filthy gutters where rats held midnight meetings. Tonight, a ragtag band of barbers and disgruntled peasants gathered behind the baker's chimney, clutching a crudely drawn map of the Lord's Guard post, where a glittering set of razors, stolen from the sacred Barbers' Guild, sat under iron shackles. Their leader, old Mervyn, whispered the plan with the urgency of a tavern brawl, promising that once reclaimed, the town's hair could finally be cut without the Lord's tax on each lock. The air smelled of stale sourdough and the sharp tang of fear, making every breath feel like a draft of rebellion. Even the town's resident jester, Jax, muttered a half-hearted joke about saving the world one split end at a time, his grin a thin, razorer edge of irony. As midnight struck, the conspirators slipped through the narrow alleys, their souls muffled by the slime of spilled ale that clung to the stones. Mervyn led them to the wooden palisade, where they lowered a rope slick with sweat and the faint scent of pine tar, hoping the guards would hear nothing but the wind's sigh. Inside the courtyard, torches flickered like rebellious TikTok videos, casting frantic shadows that danced across the stone walls. The thieves' hearts hammered louder than the distant clank of armor, each pulse a drumbeat echoing the ancient rhyme. Cut the hair, cut the tyranny. Yet every step forward felt heavier, as if the very ground were soaked in the ghost of centuries-old grooming edicts, enforcing a law that said a man's head must stay unshaven unless the Lord decreed otherwise. Just as they reached the iron chest, a cold voice slipped through the darkness. "Hold, I know the lock's combination." It was Tomas, the miller's son, who had been flirting with the Lord's daughter and now wore the Lord's colors like a badge of shame. He grinned, flashing a silver dagger, and whispered that he'd sold the secret to the guard captain for 12 fresh loaves and a promise of no more split ends on his wife's scalp. The air turned rank with the metallic scent of betrayal, mingling with the foul odor of rotting fruit from the market stalls nearby. Mervyn's eyes narrowed, and the group realized their midnight haircut was about to become a very messy shave, both for the town's pride and their own throats. The guard captain burst from the shadows, his armor clanking like a medieval version of a Spotify playlist, loud, relentless, and utterly unavoidable. Swords sang, ricocheting off stone, while the townsfolk scrambled, the clang of steel mixing with the guttural shouts of "For the Lord," and the squeal of a terrified pig slipping into the mud. In the chaos, the razor set slipped from its shackles, glinting like a rebellious lightsaber, and a stray foot kicked it across the courtyard, scattering blades that cut through the night air and a few unfortunate ankles. Blood seeped into the cobbles, spreading a coppery perfume that made even the rats pause, as if to give a silent applause for the absurdity of fighting over hair. Through it all, Jax shouted, "May the force be with our barbers," and the townspeople, half laughing, half crying, pressed forward, determined to snatch the sacred steel even if their fingers got a little more trimmed. When the dust settled, the razor set lay in the hands of the trembling peasants, its cold steel a reminder that law and habit can be as fragile as a newly cut mop of hair. The townsfolk gathered around the ancient stone altar of the barber saint, each feeling the weight of breaking a tradition older than the castle's moat, yet also the sweet relief of finally shaving off the Lord's oppressive tax. Old Mervyn raised the razors high, declaring, "Let this be the first day we cut not only hair, but also the tyranny that keeps us bald-eyed and broke." The crowd erupted in cheers, a chorus that sounded suspiciously like a medieval version of a stadium roar after a surprise victory in a video game boss fight. And as the first sunrise painted the sky pink, the scent of fresh cut hair mingled with the lingering smell of burnt toast, sealing a night where betrayal, bravery, and a bunch of shiny blades rewrote the town's grooming code forever. The annual market feast exploded in a riot of colors and clamor, banners snapping like angry gulls above the cobblestones. Roast pork hissed on open flames, while the stink of unwashed bodies and fermented ale mingled in the humid air. In the middle of the chaos, Elspeth slipped through the crowd, a sack of gleaming razor blades clanking against her belt like a secret orchestra. Villagers cheered as jugglers tossed flaming torches, oblivious to the metallic whisper that followed her steps. She was a one-woman rebellion wrapped in a linen apron, eyes glittering with mischief and resolve. When the Lord, a portly man with a crown of wilted rosemary, swaggered onto the makeshift stage, Elspeth hoisted the stolen razors like a medieval Excalibur. "Your Grace!" she shouted, brandishing the ancient manuscript she'd pilfered from the Abbey's dusty vault. "The scissors' edge is not a mere legend but law." The parchment crackled, its faded ink smelling of mildew and vinegar, as the crowd hushed to a tense murmur. Her voice cut through the din, sharper than any blade, and the Lord's gold-threaded robe seemed to flutter in sudden dread. Even the town drummer halted, his drumsticks hovering like startled crows. A heated trial erupted, with the Lord's advisers arguing that grooming was a sacred privilege, while Elspeth cited the forgotten clause that forbade illegal shaving under penalty of death. The courtroom, really just a wooden platform under a tent, reeked of sweat, animal hide, and the metallic tang of fresh steel. Voices rose like a medieval rap battle, each accusation punctuated by the slap of leather thongs and the clatter of iron shields. The judge, a gaunt monk with a beard that could shelter a sparrow, flicked his eyes between the manuscript and the razor sack, his croak echoing like a cracked pipe organ. The irony was palpable. A law meant to keep hair under control was now hair raising the whole village. The climax arrived when the Lord, his cheeks flushed like overcooked porridge, threatened to invoke the most severe clause: public execution for anyone caught wielding illegal grooming tools. A hush fell as thick as the stale bread crusts piled on the benches, and the crowd pressed forward, noses twitching at the smell of fear and boiled cabbage. Elspeth stepped forward, the razors glinting like tiny lightsabers against the dusk, and declared, "If you wish to cut my head off, do it with a pair of scissors, not a sword. Let the law cut you instead." The spectators gasped, some clutching their own beards, others giggling nervously as if they'd just seen a medieval version of a cat video meme. The tension crackled, electric and grim, like the moment before a thunderstorm strikes a thatched roof. In the end, the Lord, caught between his own vanity and the absurdity of his decree, lowered his sword and grudgingly handed the razors back to the village, muttering that the law was a hairy beast best left untrimmed. Elspeth bowed, the manuscript fluttering like a banner of victory, and the crowd erupted into cheers louder than a tavern brawl after a spilled ale barrel. Children ran past, their hair wild and unshorn, chanting a rhyme that sounded suspiciously like a modern pop chorus about cutting loose. As the sun sank, casting the market in a copper glow, the scent of fresh scissor steel lingered, a reminder that even the fiercest laws can be snipped away by a bold voice. The scissor's edge, now a legend told over mugs of mead, proved that sometimes the sharpest weapon is a witty retort. The town square thrummed like a medieval tick-tock, with bakers pounding dough and the village crier shouting about hairlessness laws. Women clutching bristly brooms and men with ragged beards gathered around the stone well, their faces twisted in a mix of fury and filthy resolve. They chanted a chorus of "Cleanliness is next to godliness" that rose above the clatter of goat carts. Lord Aldrich, perched on his dais like an overgrown scarecrow, watched the mob with a furrowed brow and a rumbling belly from the day's pork feast. The scent of smoked herring and sweat hung heavy, and even the pigeons seemed to coo in disapproval, nudging the lord toward a decision. When the bell tolled noon, Aldrich rose, his cloak swishing like a judge's robe in a courtroom drama, and declared the old statutes void. He swapped the draconian edicts for modest regulations that merely required a weekly shave and a public bath, as if replacing a death sentence with a slightly less dramatic Netflix binge. The townsfolk erupted in cheers that sounded like clinking pewter mugs, their laughter echoing off the timbered walls. Aldrich's scribes scribbled the new law on parchment soaked in ale, ensuring the ink smelled of rebellion and barley. The decree, though simple, felt as fresh as a newly forged sword, slicing through the grime of the past. Soon the square transformed into a makeshift spa, with wooden barrels filled with steaming water that hissed like a dragon's sneeze. Old Maureen, the herbalist, ladled fragrant lavender leaves into the bubbles, sending a perfume that mingled with the earthy odor of horse manure, an oddly comforting perfume of progress. Barbers brandished razors sharper than gossip, their blades glinting under the midday sun like lightsabers in a medieval cosplay. Children darted between the legs of bearded men, their giggles ricocheting off the stone walls, while the scent of fresh cut hair floated like confetti at a royal wedding. The whole scene resembled a chaotic but heartfelt makeover montage, straight out of a binge-watchable series. The communal wash began with a splash that drenched the crowd, sending a chorus of shocked yelps and delighted shrieks through the air. Soap suds clung to faces like frothy beards, and the roar of the water drowned out any lingering complaints about the old laws, turning them into nothing more than a distant murmur. As barbers snipped, the sound of shears cut through the chatter like a DJ dropping a beat, each cut releasing a puff of hair that drifted like confetti at a Renaissance rave. Laughter bubbled up whenever someone emerged with a head as smooth as a polished shield, and the smell of fresh hair mingled with the lingering tang of boiled cabbage. By sunset, the square glittered with wet cobblestones, and even the town's grimy cat seemed to preen with newfound pride. When the last strand of hair fell to the ground, the townspeople stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes bright with a dignity that no decree could strip away. Aldrich, now sporting a modest, trimmed beard, nodded approvingly, feeling the weight of his crown lift like a feather after a long siege. The communal wash had become a ritual of rebirth, its echo resonating through the alleys, promising that cleanliness could indeed be next to godliness, and maybe even a bit cooler. The townsfolk toasted with mugs of honey mead, their cheeks flushed from the steam and triumph, while the moon rose, casting a silvery sheen on their freshly shorn heads. In that moment, hope sheared through the past like a new haircut through tangled hair, binding the community tighter than any medieval oath could. Milo, a lanky apprentice with more needle-sized dreams than coin, shuffled through the cobbled lanes of Bruges at dawn. The market stalls puffed out clouds of fresh wool, smoked herring, and the sour tang of tallow candles. His master, Master Dirick, barked orders over the clang of a hammer, his voice as rough as the canvas draped over the loom. Every stitch Milo pulled seemed to echo against the town's stone teeth, a rhythm that matched the clatter of carts and the chatter of gossip. Little did he know, the very threads he was learning to twist would soon tie him to a law as tight as a corset on a courtier. At the heart of Flanders lay a scroll of sumptuary edicts, a medieval dress code with the bite of a tax collector and the flair of a runway show. The law decreed that only nobles could wear scarlet silk trimmed with gold, while peasants were relegated to dull brown linens and rough hemp. Colors were classified like guilds: azure for merchants, verdant green for clerics, and blood red for the aristocracy's blood-spilling tournaments. Master Dirick, with a wink, told Milo that a misplaced trim could earn a man a fine bigger than the kingdom's cheese vault. Milo's fingers trembled as he catalogued each forbidden stitch, feeling the loom of law pulling tighter around his apprentice's throat. One humid afternoon, a gaunt peasant named Joris strutted into the workshop, flaunting a ragged cloak dyed the exact shade of a duke's banner. The crimson clung to his skin like spilled wine, and the village murmurs rose to a roar as eyes widened in horrified fascination. Joris claimed he'd bought the fabric at a midnight barter, but the law cared not for excuses, only for the hue that dared defy hierarchy. A stern constable, his boots thudding like a drumbeat of doom, seized Joris by the collar and dragged him to the town square. The crowd held its breath, the scent of horse sweat mixing with the iron tang of impending violence. The punishment unfolded with the theatrical cruelty of a medieval guillotine commercial, except the blade was a whip of horsehair, and the audience was the entire town. Joris was stripped to his undershirt, his crimson cloak ripped apart and tossed like wilted roses into a ditch. The magistrate read the edict aloud, his voice echoing off the stone walls as Joris received 50 lashes that sang against his flesh. Blood splattered the cobbles, a dark perfume that rivaled the market's fish stalls, and the crowd gasped, some cheering, some weeping. When the blows ceased, Joris lay crumpled, his pride shredded more thoroughly than his forbidden garment. Milo watched, needle still in hand, and felt the loom of law tighten around every citizen's waist, stitching status into skin. He whispered to himself that in this world, fashion was the ultimate weapon, and the law the ruthless tailor. Later, as the sun set over the Bruges canals, Milo stitched a modest brown tunic, humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like a medieval version of Don't Stop Believin'. He swore to keep his stitches honest, lest his own thread be cut by the red-tongued enforcers of fashion. And so the loom kept turning, weaving lives into fabric, each stitch a silent verdict of life or death on the streets of feudal Europe. The dawn cracked over the cobbled lanes of Wolfhelm, spilling gold onto stalls where merchants hawked everything from salted herring to rusty hinges. Milo ducked beneath a tattered awning, his nose flooded with the sweet rot of spilled mead and the acrid bite of horse sweat. He'd heard whispers about a cloth that wasn't allowed, silks so bright they could blind a monk, and his heart thumped like a drum in a tavern brawl. The city's sumptuary code read like a medieval fashion police, punishing anyone who dared wear a hue above their station. Yet Milo, with his ragged cap and a grin as crooked as the alleyways, was about to stitch his fate into the very fabric of rebellion. That night the guild gathered in the cellar of the Old Weasel, a place where moldy barrels whispered secrets louder than the town crier. Led by Greta, a wiry woman whose fingers could thread a needle through a tapestry of lies, they unrolled bolts of silk that glimmered like spilled moonlight. Milo slipped his arms into the forbidden fabric, feeling the smoothness against his skin, like a unicorn's mane, if unicorns existed in the Middle Ages. Each roll was wrapped in oilcloth to mask the scent, because the royal inspectors could sniff a contraband cloth as easily as a dog sniffs pork. With every covert shipment, the guild stitched a silent protest, humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like, "We will rock you on a lute." Enter Lady Isolde, the royal enforcer whose eyes were as cold as iron gauntlets, and whose reputation for fines was louder than the market's chatter. She marched through the stalls with a clipboard that seemed to double as a war cry, demanding proof of every color and thread. Rumor had it she once confiscated a peacock-feathered cloak and turned it into a mop for the castle kitchens. Talk about recycling fashion. The merchants trembled, their tongues stuck in the waxy smell of beeswax candles as they whispered about the new inspections. Milo felt the pressure tighten, like a corset stitched by a sadistic tailor, and he knew the guild would have to get craftier than a cat burglar on a diet of stale bread. The guild's answer lay in a labyrinth of forgotten tunnels beneath the market, a damp underworld that reeked of mildew, rat droppings, and the occasional whiff of incense from clandestine prayer rooms. Lanterns flickered, casting jittery shadows that danced like mischievous sprites on walls slick with centuries of runoff. Milo led a convoy of silk-laden carts down the low arches, the fabric thumping against his boots like a secret drumline. Every dripping echo threatened to betray them to Isolde's patrols, whose boots clanged above like a metal band rehearsing for war. Yet the tunnels also hummed with the promise of freedom, the smell of earth mixing with the sweet perfume of silk, a heady cocktail of rebellion. Just as the silk reached the merchant's hidden loft, a sudden shout cracked through the stone. Lady Isolde herself, brandishing a badge that shone like a badge of superhero authority. Milo's heart hammered, his hands slick with sweat and the grit of the tunnel, and for a split second he imagined the scene as a medieval version of Mission Impossible. The guild scattered like startled sparrows, some grabbing the precious bolts, others diving into the darkness to become one with the shadows. In the end, a few silks slipped through the cracks, draping over shoulders of men too poor to own such colors, making a quiet statement that even laws sewn in iron can be unraveled. And somewhere, beneath the market's din, the rebels laughed, soft, defiant, and as bright as the very fabric they risked everything for. The great hall of Castle Drayton thrummed with clattering silverware and the pungent perfume of roasted boar. Candles sputtered, casting amber halos that made the tapestries look like dripping honey. At the head of the long oak table, King Aldrich raised a goblet, his crown glinting like a bad Wi-Fi signal over a medieval network. Suddenly, a lanky minceler slipped through the entourage, draped in a velvet cloak the color of midnight espresso, his shoes scuffed and his lute case humming with mischief. A gasp rippled through the court as the sumptuary codes, those draconian dress laws, snapped like a twine of rope around his ragged attire. Murmurs rose to a roar, the courtiers' whispers turning into a chorus of offended hisses, like 1,000 mice discovering a cheese banquet. The steward's nose lifted in disgust at the smell of cheap ale leaking from the minceler's satchel, mingling with the fragrant rose garlands. A gaunt page burst forth with a parchment, shouting the king's edict that only nobility may wear velvet, lest they be stripped of life as swiftly as a sock from a minceler's foot. The noblewomen clutched their pearls, eyes widening as if someone had just announced a surprise Game of Thrones episode. The king's guard, arms crossed like a badly programmed robot, stepped forward, swords sheathed but tension humming louder than a lute string about to snap. In the shadowed alcove, Milo the scribe twitched his quill, feeling the weight of ink like a stone in his palm. He watched the minceler's fate teeter on the edge of a dagger, his heart drumming a war-like rhythm against his ribs. The decree promised death for any commoner who dared flaunt forbidden fabrics, a rule so strict it made even the castle's rats wear tiny, invisible waistcoats. Milo knew his testimony could tilt the scales, but speaking might label him a traitor, sealing his own throat with the same velvet for blood law. He swallowed a mouthful of cold bread, the gritty crust scraping his tongue, and wondered if silence would be his only armor. Outside the stone walls, the town of Greyford simmered like a cauldron of stew left too long, the stink of sweat and soot rising from the cobbled streets. Women in plain homespun whispered about the minceler's boldness, their eyes flashing like flickering torches in a midnight tavern. The king's decrees had turned every tailor into a secret assassin, cutting seams and cutting throats with equal zeal. A street vendor shouted, "If they can wear velvet, why can't we wear justice?" A line that cracked the air like a cheap joke on a courtroom TV drama. The crowd's murmurs swelled, promising that the next rebellion might be stitched not in silk, but in the blood of those who enforced the dress code. Milo rose, his parchment trembling like a nervous cat, and stepped into the bright torchlight that bathed the tribunal. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing off the stone as if a dragon hiccuped in the distance, and declared the minceler's cloak a symbol, not a crime. The judge frowned, his beard bristling like a bad beard trim meme, but Milo's words cut sharper than any sword, exposing the absurdity of a law that punished a stitch. The king, face turning the shade of a bruised apple, hesitated, then ordered the minceler's life be spared, though his velvet would be confiscated for the royal laundry. As the hall exhaled, Milo felt a strange mix of relief and dread, knowing he had sown a tiny seam of resistance that might one day unravel the whole tapestry of oppression. The great hall thrummed with the rustle of silk and the clatter of iron gauntlets as Milo took the stand, his voice snapping like a whip crack in the cold stone. He pointed a trembling finger at the royal ledger, exposing a secret trade where crimson velvet, once the exclusive cloak of nobles, had been hawked to market women in the cobbled streets. The courtiers gasped, their breath fogging in the torchlight, while the scent of mildew and old parchment hung heavy like an accusation. A murmur rose from the benches, a chorus of disbelief and dread, as the truth stitched itself into the very fabric of the law. Even the king's beard seemed to bristle at the scandal, each hair a tiny flag of outrage. With a flourish that would make a Shakespearean villain proud, the king bellowed his verdict. All who dared drape themselves in prohibited hue must pay with blood. He ordered a mass execution, the kind where swords sang and gauntleted feet marched to the rhythm of a funeral drum. Iron shackles clanged, the stench of sweat and fear mingling with the metallic tang of fresh cuts. The crowd watched, half horrified, half oddly entertained, as if the spectacle were a medieval reality TV show. Think Game of Thrones meets a public execution live stream. The irony was as thick as the crimson stains on the floor. A law meant to preserve order now threatened to drown the kingdom in its own cruelty. Just as the king's decree reached its fever pitch, a scream cracked through the hall. A tapestry depicting the king's victorious hunt caught alight, its colors exploding like fireworks in a night sky. Flames licked the embroidered lions, sending curls of smoke that smelled of charred wool and melted wax to the nostrils of every onlooker. The crackling blazed through shadows that danced like a macabre ballet, turning the solemn stone walls into a flickering theater of chaos. Screams turned to coughs as the heat turned polished armor into a sauna, and the one-swordered procession of executioners stumbled over their own feet. Milo, eyes wide, whispered a wry comment about the ultimate wardrobe malfunction, while the court scrambled like panicked actors forgetting their lines. In the pandemonium, the judges huddled under a fallen column, their robes smoldering and their once imposing authority reduced to a sweaty scramble for any dry parchment. The king, his crown askew from the heat, waved a clenched fist as if directing traffic in a medieval rush hour, shouting that law must still prevail. Yet his voice sounded as cracked as the burning tapestry behind him. Servants darted in, their lanterns sputtering, casting jittery halos that made the scene look like a low-budget Lord of the Rings set on fire. The irony dripped from every flame-soaked thread. The very sumptuary code meant to keep peasants in rags now forced the aristocracy to confront the chaos of their own over-styled oppression. A lone squire, face smudged with soot, muttered that perhaps the kingdom should trade the red decree for a fire exit plan. When the last ember sputtered out, the hall lay in ash, the crimson verdict reduced to a charred scrap of fabric that fluttered like a sad flag. The king, now soot-streaked and humbled, proclaimed a new edict. No more secret sales, no more deadly drapes, but a softer rule that let a commoner's shirt be honest without risking a guillotine-style death. Milo, still trembling, smiled wryly, noting that the kingdom had finally learned that clothing could indeed dictate life or death, and that sometimes a good fire is the best tailor. The courtiers, half cynical, half relieved, clapped their gauntleted hands, the sound echoing like a distant drum roll for a comedy of errors. As the survivors dusted themselves off, the crimson verdict lived on only in whispered legends, a reminder that in feudal Europe, a wardrobe malfunction could rewrite history. The smoke of the last battle still clung to the cobbles like a stubborn aftershave, and the rebels' banners, once a riot of forbidden reds and blues, lay in tatters. Lords in polished armor sniffed the charred scent of wool, half expecting the next decree to demand gray tunics for all. Yet the streets whispered a different tale, the kind of hushed gossip that survived even the harshest sumptuary codes. A scarred Milo, still nursing a jagged cut on his cheek, limped towards the town square, his boots squelching in puddles of spilled ale and blood. The city's walls, once a runway of oppression, now seemed to hold their breath, waiting for a new pattern to unfold. In the dim light of the tavern, the surviving rebels gathered around a battered table, negotiating a softened code with a pragmatism that would make a modern lawyer blush. They bargained for a sliver of color, just enough for artisans to weave crimson thread into a single cuff, a nod to their old flamboyance without sparking a full-blown fashion war. The council, a bunch of stone-faced nobles who smelled faintly of mildew and fear, reluctantly signed a parchment that read, "Limited hues permitted. No more death by dye." Laughter cracked the gloom when one rebel compared the new rule to the latest fashion edict on a reality TV show, saying, "It's like Survivor, but the immunity idol is a blue sash." The deal, scented with cheap ale and optimism, felt like a fragile tapestry waiting for a skilled hand to stitch it together. Milo, his face a map of fresh scars and old battles, stared at his reflection in a cracked bottle, seeing a man who looked like he'd survived a medieval version of a superhero movie, minus the cape, plus a lot more grime. The scar on his cheek throbbed rhythmically, a drumbeat echoing the clatter of the forge nearby, where iron sang against stone. He could still taste the metallic tang of blood on his tongue, a reminder that clothing had once decided who lived and who was turned into a canvas for executioners. Yet his hands, calloused from years of stitching, tingled with an eager electricity, as if each needle could stitch not just fabric but destiny itself. With a half grin that hinted at irony, he whispered, "Time to give the world a new dress code, one that doesn't require a death certificate for a crimson ribbon." Under the flickering glow of a single oil lamp, Milo began to stitch the first banner of the new order, his fingers dancing like a jazz solo across the loom. He threaded a deep scarlet strand, once forbidden, now officially sanctioned, through the weave, each pull of the needle releasing a faint scent of pine resin and burned hair. The banner grew, striped with muted earth tones that whispered of peasants' fields, punctuated by that daring splash of red that shouted, "We're still here, and we've got style." A stray cat sauntered by, tail twitching to the rhythm of Milo's work, as if approving the rebellion's new aesthetic. When the final stitch clicked into place, the cloth fluttered proudly, catching the night breeze like a flag in a blockbuster finale, promising that future judgments would be made by deeds, not drab dyes. The newly unfurled banner swayed above the square, its colors catching the lantern light and casting a kaleidoscope of hope onto the stone faces of onlookers. Children, who had once been forced to wear drab grays like walking shadows, gasped in delight, their fingers reaching out to feel the soft fabric, as if it might erase the memory of the day a hue meant a death sentence. Milo stood back, his scar glinting in the firelight, and felt a strange pride, like a director watching the final cut of a film where the villains finally get their comeuppance. The old sumptuary code, once a ruthless dress code dictatorship, now lay in tatters, replaced by a rule that let people choose their own threads without fearing the axe. In that moment, the city seemed to breathe a collective sigh, as if the very air had been dyed in a shade of freedom no ruler could ever ban. In the mist-shrouded valley of Eldermore, the air smelled of damp moss and rusted iron, as if the hills themselves were chewing on old swords. Lady Alara of House Alden stood on the crumbling stone balcony, her violet gown fluttering like a startled raven. She was promised to Sir Rowan, a distant lord whose coat of arms featured a wolf chasing a hare, an emblem that, according to village gossip, doubled as a warning sign. Their marriage contract lay on a table of oak, inked in black as midnight and sealed with a wax stamp that hissed like a wounded serpent. Yet hidden among the flourishes was a clause demanding a blood price if the union failed to produce a male heir, a stipulation that would soon turn love into a ledger of dread. The wedding day erupted with the clang of copper bells and the clatter of peasants' wooden cups, each splash echoing like a medieval karaoke night. As the priest droned over the holy verses, the scent of roasted boar swirled with the pungent tang of spilled ale, making the crowd's throats feel like they were swallowing leather. Sir Rowan, towering in chainmail that squeaked with every step, raised his hand to toast, only to glance nervously at the clause scrawled in the margins, like a footnote in a bedtime story. Ilara's father, Lord Alden, tried to smile through a beard of soot, his eyes darting to the parchment as if it might bite. The whole scene played out like a medieval version of a reality show, except the camera was a wandering mince's lute. The clause itself read like a medieval fine print nightmare. Should the marriage yield no son, the bride shall render a blood price equal to the cost of 3 newborn lambs, drawn from her own veins. In other words, if Ilara failed to produce a He-Man heir, she'd be forced to bleed herself dry for the sake of the family's coffers. A plot twist even Netflix would hesitate to dramatize. The court gossips whispered that the blood price was a euphemism for a brutal public penance, perhaps a public dunking in the swamp that smelled of rot and regret. Sir Rowan chuckled, though his laughter sounded more like a rusty hinge. He imagined himself as a knight in a video game, where fail meant an extra life loss. The irony was thick enough to cut with a butter knife, and the villagers began to wonder whether love was just a clever way to hide a tax audit. As the seasons turned, the couple settled into a manor where the walls were lined with tapestries depicting heroic battles, and oddly enough, a few cartoonish dragons. Ilara spent afternoons polishing armor while humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like a medieval rap about love and looting. Yet each night, the silence of the empty nursery echoed louder than the clamor of the feast hall, and the fear of the blood price gnawed at her like a mouse in a cheese shop. Sir Rowan, meanwhile, practiced his swordplay with a wooden dummy that squeaked every time it hit, as if mocking his own impotent attempts at fatherhood. Their servants whispered that the contract was a cursed app, like a medieval Tinder, where a swipe left could cost you your life force. The first child born to the Aldens was a daughter with hair the color of sunrise wheat, and the household celebrated with a feast that smelled of honey and triumph, until the clause's shadow loomed like an ominous storm cloud. Lord Alden, eyes slick with sweat, read the contract again, his fingers trembling as if the parchment might bite. The family's future now hung on a fragile thread, fraying under the weight of a law that turned lineage into a ledger of blood. In the darkness of the night, the wind howled through the valley, carrying the scent of wet stone and whispered curses, as if Eldermore itself were muttering, "May the next heir be male, or else—" The binding of House Alden had become a tale of love, law, and lethal irony, a story that would echo through taverns long after the last candle sputtered out. When the midwife's cries rose above the thatch-roofed cottage, the firstborn daughter, Marin, blinked into a world already iron-bound by ink. The Alden family, still drunk on celebration, heard the ancient clause ripple through the parchment like a cursed tick-tock trend. It was the clause of blood debt, a sentence that demanded a servant's life each year until a male heir broke the cycle. The village's stone walls seemed to shudder, as if the very mortar sensed the impending doom. Even the hearth's fire flickered with a nervous, almost sarcastic glow, as if the gods were watching a medieval reality show. Lord Alden slammed the contract on the oak table, the quill's ink spattering like spilled mead across the room. The steward read aloud, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like a wind in a hollowed-out barrel, announcing the first execution will be the youngest stable hand, Joran. The villagers gathered, faces pale as freshly churned butter, eyes darting between the gallows and the grain sacks that smelled of stale sweat and horse manure. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, hearing the clang of the blacksmith's hammer that now sounded like a death knell for a neighbor. The air was thick with the scent of fear, a mix of damp earth and the coppery tang of impending blood. Ilara, Marin's mother, felt her heart pound like a war drum inside her ribcage, each beat echoing the clang of the judge's gavel. She paced the courtyard, the cold stone biting her bare feet, while the village gossip swirled around her like a gust of stale laundry. Her conscience wrestled with the clause, a legal monster that demanded souls as if it were a twisted loyalty program. Collect 10 executions, get a son free. She tasted bitterness on her tongue, like the sour ale that the blacksmith's apprentice spilled in a hasty toast. Yet in the distance, a lone raven croaked, its caw sounding suspiciously like a sarcastic commentator shouting. And that's how you lose a servant. The first execution day arrived with a sky as gray as a wizard's beard, and the entire village seemed to hold its breath in unison. Joran was led to the scaffold, his feet slapping the mud, the smell of fresh straw mixing with the pungent odor of fear. As the rope tightened, a collective gasp rose, then fell to a morbid hush, punctuated only by the distant howl of a lone wolf that sounded eerily like a Netflix trailer voice-over. Coming soon, more deaths, fewer sons. The onlookers winced, some wiping tears with the backs of their hands, others chuckling nervously, as if humor could shield them from the blade's arc. The clause, a cruel accountant, scribbled another entry, its ink glistening with the blood of the hapless servant. Weeks turned into months, and the villagers learned to count the days by the thud of each execution, a grim metronome that beat against their hopes. Ilara watched Marin grow, her laughter ringing like a bell that refused to be silenced by the clause's dark melody. Rumors whispered that a son might be born soon, a rumor that tasted sweeter than honeyed mead, but was as uncertain as a dragon's flight path. The Alden household, now draped in mourning shawls, prepared a feast that would celebrate a potential son, sprinkling the stew with herbs that smelled of both triumph and dread. As the hearth crackled, Ilara whispered a prayer to any deity listening, hoping that the next clause written in the contract would be one of love, not of blood. The moon hung like a tarnished coin over the stone walls of Castle Ardent, where Sir Rowan paced in his great hall, his boots thudding against the cold flagstones. He clenched his gauntleted fist around a parchment stained with ink and blood, the clause that demanded a male heir by any means. "If I lose my honor, I shall forge it in fire," he declared, eyes flickering like torches. His men, half drunk and half crazed, cheered, their laughter echoing off the tapestries. Little did they know the raid would taste less of glory, and more of mud and misery. At dawn, sirens of clanging steel rang as Rowan's raiding party descended upon the rival manor, its thatched roofs smoking like a dragon's sneeze. The fields smelled of damp earth and fear, while swords sang a grim lullaby against armor, spilling barley-stained blood onto the cobblestones. Peasants screamed, their cries mingling with the clatter of hooves, and the scent of burnt wood rose like a bad incense. When the Lord's sun fell, the clause was satisfied, but the victory felt as hollow as a cracked goblet. Even the crows seemed to whisper, "Game of Thrones," more like Game of Groans. Back in the castle, Alara slipped through shadowed corridors to meet a wandering monk whose habit smelled of incense and old parchment. The monk, with a grin as crooked as a broken oar, whispered of a forgotten legal loophole buried in the codex of feudal fancies, a clause that could nullify any forced heir if the marriage was sealed under duress. Their candle flickered, casting jittery silhouettes on the stone walls as Alara's heart hammered like a war drum. She scribbled the revelation on a scrap of vellum, eyes darting at every creak, fearing the castle's stone ears. The monk muttered, "May the force be with your paperwork," before vanishing into the night. Alara's mind raced like a stallion on a thunderstorm-slick field. To invoke the loophole meant branding Sir Rowan a traitor before the crown itself. She imagined the royal jail's iron doors slamming shut, the scent of stale sweat and desperation seeping through the iron bars. Yet the promise of a free choice for the slain heir's sister, who deserved more than a pawn in a blood-soaked chess game, sparked a fierce defiance. She tucked the vellum into her bodice, feeling the rough fibers against her skin like a secret weapon. If the crown's wrath descended, it would be hotter than a medieval meme gone viral. When the day of judgment arrived, the throne room smelled of polished oak and underlying tension, the air thick enough to cut with a dagger. Sir Rowan strutted in, armor clanking like a metal metronome, while Alara stepped forward, parchment trembling like a nervous cat. She read the loophole aloud, each word echoing off the vaulted ceiling, and the courtiers gasped as if they'd just seen a dragon perform a tick-tock dance. The crown's magistrate, face as red as a boiled beet, sputtered, "By the king's decree," before the ancient clause toppled like a house of cards. In the end, honor survived not through bloodshed, but through a clever quill, proving that sometimes the sharpest sword is a well-written sentence. The council chamber roared with a storm that seemed to have swallowed a dragon, rain hammering the leaded windows like 1,000 angry drummers. Candles sputtered, casting trembling shadows on the oak table, where Alara unfurled a vellum scroll older than most castles. The parchment smelled of damp moss and old ink, a nostalgic perfume that made even the stone walls wince. With a voice as sharp as a hawk's talon, she declared, "Behold the ancient charter that binds this lord to a cruel clause." The assembled nobles shifted uneasily, their cloaks rustling like restless wolves. Sir Rowan's eyes blazed brighter than the torches, his jaw clenched as if a siege engine had lodged itself in his throat. He snatched his sword from its polished sheath, the metal singing a grating note that cut through the thunder's bass. "Aren't you tired of hiding behind legal gobbledygook?" he roared, his humor as thin as the parchment he'd just seen. The clang of steel against steel echoed, a duel about to begin in a room that smelled of wet stone and sweat. The irony was palpable. The very clause meant to protect a family now threatened to shred it in half. The duel erupted like a scene from a medieval action movie. Imagine Game of Thrones meets a slapstick comedy, with swords flying and mud splattering like paint. Rowan's blade whistled past Alara's uncle, slicing a candle that fell and sputtered, sending a puff of waxy smoke into the air. Blood spurted onto the floor, bright as freshly spilled ale, while the storm outside drummed a relentless rhythm on the roof. Each strike sang a story of honor, vengeance, and the absurdity of fighting over ink. Yet even as the combatants clashed, a thin grin slipped across the monk's lips, as if he were watching his favorite binge-watch series unfold in real life. At the height of the frenzy, Brother Thaddeus stepped forward, his habit swaying like a humble banner in a gale. He raised a hand, and the chapel's ancient organ cracked a low chord that seemed to hush the very wind. "Enough!" he shouted, voice resonant as a cathedral bell, forcing the combatants to freeze mid-swing. With a flourish, he produced a holy relic, a tiny silver chalice that glimmered like a Wi-Fi signal in a dark cellar, reminding all that divine law trumped mortal contracts. The monk's calm, like a cool draft through a scorching forge, made even the most hardened lord lower his blade and stare at his own reflected shame. Defeated, the lord slumped into his chair, the thunder outside now sounding like applause for his humbled surrender. He muttered a grudging oath to relinquish the claim, his voice trembling like a lute string about to snap. The ancient charter was rolled up and cast into the storm's maw, disappearing amid the rain's oily scent and the acrid tang of burnt wax. As the monks chanted a closing hymn, the council erupted into laughter, the kind that echoes through stone corridors for generations. Thus the day of reckoning ended not with bloodshed alone, but with a reminder that even the toughest clauses can be melted away by a well-timed roar of compassion. When the council's gavel finally fell, the inked parchment that once shackled the Alden clan crumbled like stale bread left in the rain. The villagers gathered around the fire, the smell of pine smoke mixing with the sour tang of sweat and spilled ale. Children chased the shards of the contract, their laughter echoing off the stone walls as if to mock the dead seriousness of the old law. Marin stood at the threshold, her boots mud-splattered, eyes bright with a fierce resolve that cut through the gloom. Even the old blacksmith swore he felt lighter, as if a leaden chain had been ripped from his own wrist. The council, still smelling of burnt incense and fresh cut hay, declared Marin the rightful heir, handing her a brass key that glinted like a promise. She accepted it with a steady hand, feeling the cool metal bite into her palm, a reminder that power can be as sharp as a sword. The villagers sang old ballads, their voices rough as oak bark, weaving Marin's name into every chorus. Even the town's rooster, usually a sarcastic morning commentator, crowed a little louder, as if approving the shift. The Alden house, once a fortress of fear, began to look more like a bustling tavern at twilight. In the weeks that followed, a new charter was etched onto the town square's stone slab, its letters bold enough to scare off any lingering tyrant. The law banned clauses that demanded a bride's silence, a husband's blood oath, or any punishment involving goats and midnight curses. Traders from the next county stopped over, sniffing the fresh parchment like detectives hunting a fresh crime scene, and nodded in approval. Children painted the new rules on the walls with chalk, giggling when the old, nasty stipulations were crossed out with a crimson slash. The air smelled of fresh ink and liberated hope, a scent sweeter than the village's infamous stew. Now love in Alden's valley sprouted like wildflowers after a drought, unforced and vivid. Couples exchanged vows beneath the old oak, its leaves rustling like applause, while the wind carried whispers of promises instead of threats. Meals were shared, the table groaning under loaves, cheese, and the occasional surprise. Like that time a minstrel tossed a blueberry pie at the mayor, and everyone burst into laughter. Even the blacksmith, who once hammered out iron bars for cruel penalties, now forged wedding bands that sang when struck, a literal love song. The future felt as bright as a sunrise over the river, unmarred by the shadows of yesterday's contracts. If you thought this saga sounded like a Game of Thrones episode that accidentally stumbled into a Hallmark movie, you'd be half right, minus the dragons, plus a few more mud pies. The villagers now throw no-claws festivals, where the only thing that gets tied up is a rope for a tug of war, and the only blood spilled is from a rogue tomato in the pie-eating contest. Marin, now affectionately called Chief of Hearts, teaches the kids that a good marriage is built on trust, not on the threat of a goat to the throne ritual. The once grim contracts are now museum pieces, gathering dust like ancient relics of a bad sitcom plot. And as the sun dips, the sky blushes, a reminder that every ending can be a fresh, slightly sarcastic, and wildly hopeful beginning. The royal trumpeters blared across Ardentia's hills, announcing the bloodied beauty pageant with a flourish that would make any modern reality TV promo blush. Noble maidens from glittering manors streamed toward the stone citadel, their gowns rustling like dry leaves in a windstorm of ambition. The citadel's walls, blackened by centuries of soot and blood, seemed to inhale the scent of fresh marble mixed with the iron tang of old sacrifices. As the sun sank, casting a crimson veil over the courtyard, the girls' nervous laughter echoed off the battlements, sounding like a chorus of nervous squirrels. Little did they know, this year's contest promised more than a crown. It promised a front-row seat to the kingdom's darkest theater. In the great hall, Lady Selene glided forward, her velvet cloak whispering like a cat burglar on silk. She raised a chalice of dark wine, its surface rippling with the memory of former queen's blood, and with a grin that could have made the Grinch jealous, announced the hidden covenant. "The queen must be forged in fire and flesh," she declared, her voice swinging between a courtroom drama and a Netflix true crime teaser. The maidens exchanged glances, half horrified, half thinking this was a clever marketing ploy for the upcoming Game of Thrones spin-off. Yet the stone floor trembled beneath them, as if the citadel itself was chuckling at their naive squeamishness. The rite of combat began with the clang of steel, as each contender was handed a battered mace that smelled of rust and old sweat. Spectators cheered like a medieval stadium, the roars rising above the scent of burned pine and the metallic perfume of fresh wounds. When the first maiden slashed through a wooden dummy, splinters sprayed like confetti at a chaotic wedding, and her eyes glittered with a mix of terror and fierce determination. Behind the pyre, a sacrificial goat, a reluctant celebrity, bleated a mournful aria that would make any Broadway diva weep. Blood oozed onto the flagstones, turning the courtyard into a grotesque tie-dye, while some onlookers whispered that the queen's future would be as sticky as the mess. As the combat raged, whispers curled through the crowd like smoke from a tavern hearth, carrying rumors that Lady Selene's agenda was less about tradition and more about personal power moves. The Duchess of Westmere, notorious for her sharp tongue and sharper daggers, snickered, comparing the pageant to a Mortal Kombat tournament where the prize was a tiara and a lifetime of political leverage. Meanwhile, a shy minstrel strummed a lute, his melody a mournful jig that painted the scene with notes of dread and absurdity. as if a medieval tick-tock were being recorded on parchment. The air grew thick with sweat, fear, and the faint scent of lavender incense, an attempt by the court's priest to mask the carnage with something more palatable. In that uneasy cocktail of iron, incense, and stale ale, alliances formed and shattered faster than a glass goblet at a drunken feast. When the final clash echoed off the citadel's towers, Lady Selene stepped forward, wiping a smudge of crimson from her cheek with a silk handkerchief, as if she just finished a casual manicure. She lifted the blood-streaked crown, its jeweled spikes glinting like a horror movie villain's crown of thorns, and placed it upon the victorious maiden, who now wore both triumph and terror on her brow. The crowd erupted in a deafening mixture of applause, gasps, and the clinking of goblets, some celebrating, others silently Googling how to escape medieval politics. As the night deepened, the citadel's stones seemed to pulse with a low, ominous hum, reminding everyone that beauty in Ardentia was always a little bit bloody. And so the Crimson Court was set, its stage ready for the next chapter of intrigue, where queens would be crowned, secrets spilled, and the kingdom's gossip would be as sticky as the gore beneath their feet. The sun blazed over the stone arena like a guilty conscience, casting long shadows that danced behind the glittering veils of the pageant. Myra, the herbalist with knuckles stained by pine resin, lingered at the edge, inhaling a cocktail of sweaty wool and bitter sage. Sir Garrick, a knight whose armor clanked louder than a medieval metronome, surveyed the crowd with eyes that had seen more blood than a Game of Thrones season finale. A murmuring crowd whispered about beauty, while the smell of burnt incense clung to their throats, promising that even the most polished crowns could be forged in fire. Myra shuffled forward, clutching a satchel of nettle poultices, when Sir Garrick slammed a steel gauntlet onto a nearby bench, startling a flock of crows into a frantic chorus. "We need a pact," he growled, his voice as rough as raw leather, "or you'll be the next garnish on the banquet table." She hesitated, feeling the thrum of her own heartbeat like a drumbeat in a tavern brawl, then offered a tentative nod, trading a vial of calming lavender for his promise to shield her from the first arena blade. Their uneasy alliance crackled like static, a mix of mistrust and mutual survival, as the crowd's roar rose to a fever pitch. Amid the clamor, a hushed rumor slipped through the ranks like a secret handshake. The Scarlet Veil, a cloak-clad order sworn to protect those who survived the opening trial. Their emblem, a crimson ribbon fluttering against a black backdrop, glimmered in the torchlight, as if a pop culture superhero logo had been dropped into a medieval brawl. Myra's eyes widened. The scent of iron and rosemary from her herbs now mingled with a sweet, metallic perfume that seemed to emanate from the veil's hidden chambers. Sir Garrick smirked, recalling a tavern tale about a rogue faction that delivered survivors straight to the king's private harem, if you could stomach the price. The first trial erupted like a medieval roller coaster, mud splashing against steel, screams echoing off the stone walls, and the stench of crushed roses, once symbols of love, now soaked in blood. Myra stumbled, a wild thicket of vines whipping at her limbs, while Garrick swung his sword with the precision of a Netflix action hero, slicing through a charging boar that smelled of swamp gas. The Scarlet Veil members emerged from shadowed tunnels, their crimson cloaks swirling like spilled wine, chanting a hymn that sounded suspiciously like a medieval ringtone. The arena floor turned slick with sweat and gore, making each step feel like walking through a greasy pizza slice left in the sun. When the dust settled, Myra lay half-conscious on a pile of wilted lilies, the herbalist's breath ragged but alive, while Sir Garrick, armor dented like an overcooked biscuit, offered a grim grin. The Scarlet Veil approached, their leader handing Myra a sealed crimson envelope that smelled faintly of rosemary and revenge. "Welcome to the Queen's inner circle," the leader whispered, irony dripping like honey from a beehive. The Queen herself was rumored to select her consort by who survived the most grotesque beauty contest. With a sigh that tasted of victory and vinegar, Myra realized that the true veil wasn't just cloth. It was deception, alliances, and a whole lot of medieval drama worthy of a binge-watch series. The courtyard of the Arena of Thorns lay slick with crimson, a river of old blood that glistened under the waning sun. Jagged iron spikes sprouted like a garden of death, their rusted tips dripping sap like ichor. The crowd's chants rose like a choir of crows, their voices a gritty soundtrack to the smell of burnt leather and metal. In the center, a hulking beast forged from twisted iron and thorny vines snorted steam, its eyes twin coals of fury. Tonight, the maidens would be forced to hunt it, their gowns fluttering like moths against a furnace. Myra stepped forward, her eyes soft as a winter sunrise, and the crowd gasped at the incongruity of compassion in a place that chewed souls. She whispered to the beast, her words a lullaby that seemed to melt the iron's edge into something almost tender. Yet the judges barked orders like medieval drill sergeants, demanding steel and blood, not poetry. The maidens around her tightened their grips on rusted swords, their knuckles whitening like bone. Myra's heart hammered a battle drum, torn between empathy and the brutal script of queenship. Sir Garrick, the burly knight famed for slaying dragons and spilling ale, lunged first, his blade singing a screech that cut through the din. The beast retaliated, a serrated thorn whipping out and grazing Garrick's forearm, sending a spray of coppery blood that smelled of iron filings and cheap perfume. He staggered, clutching the wound, his armor clanking like a busted accordion. The maidens winced, realizing that even the invincible could be felled by a single prick of nature's cruelty. Irony dripped from the scene. The very tool meant to protect him, turned into a cruel souvenir. The rivals, Lysa with eyes like shark fins and Branna, whose smile was sharper than a courtroom gavel, glared at each other, silently trading accusations of cowardice. They whispered that Myra's mercy would ruin the kingdom, as if a queen who sang to beasts couldn't also command armies. Yet as Garrick fell, the courtyard's scent shifted from metallic to a raw animal fear that made even the toughest knight's stomach churn. A lone jester, perched on a broken column, muttered a line from a forgotten sitcom. "Nobody puts baby in a corner," as if the maiden could be saved by a cheesy punchline. The absurdity of pop culture humor in a medieval bloodbath made the crowd howl with a mix of dread and delight. In that moment, the Arena of Thorns became a mirror, reflecting every glittering crown's hidden thorns and every heroine's bruised heart. Myra lifted her trembling hand, feeling the heat of the beast's breath against her palm, and understood that queenship demanded both mercy and a willingness to bleed. Sir Garrick, still clutching his wound, managed a crooked grin, reminding everyone that heroes also collect scars like souvenir stickers. The trial ended not with a triumphant roar, but with a collective sigh, as if the kingdom collectively watched a Game of Thrones episode without the dragons. And so the maidens walked away, their gowns stained, their souls inked with the lesson that beauty, when bloodied, still tells a story worth hearing. The great hall shudders as steel slams steel, and Myra watches the final duel erupt like a medieval fireworks show gone feral. Blood splatters the stone floor, tasting iron and regret, while torches sputter, casting jittery shadows that dance like nervous goblins. The crowd's roar rises to a fever pitch, a chorus of hungry wolves ready to devour a crown. In the midst of clanging chaos, Myra spots Lady Selene slipping a blackened rune into the crown's inner band, her smile as cold as a witch's souffle. A gasp ripples through the maidens, and Myra's heart thunders louder than the battle drums. Selene's plot unfolds in a whisper louder than a cathedral's echo. She intends to bind the new queen's soul to the kingdom's darkness, turning a sovereign into a puppet of perpetual night. The cursed crown, heavy with obsidian veins, hums like an overcharged cell phone, promising power with a side of eternal gloom. Myra feels the weight of centuries of blood-soaked ambition pressing against her ribs, like a sweaty backpack full of dead roses. She catches Selene muttering a chant that smells of damp graves and burnt incense, a perfume no noble would ever wear to a banquet. The realization hits Myra like a rogue arrow. She must stop a ritual that would turn the crown into a glorified Halloween mask for the realm. With a reckless grin, Myra lunges, grabbing the crown's jagged rim and hurling herself into the eye of the storm, her sword flashing like a disco ball on a battlefield. She shouts a defiant oath, the words bursting out as raw as a teenager's first scream at a rock concert. "Not today, darkness!" The crown cracks under her weight, shards scattering like glass confetti at a twisted wedding. Blood sprays across her armor, the metallic scent mingling with the sweet ash of burnt parchment, and Myra feels the surge of ancient magic recoiling, as if the kingdom itself is hiccuping. In that split second, she sacrifices herself, becoming the living bolt that shatters the cursed artifact, her breath a ragged hymn of victory and pain. The surviving maidens, eyes wide as saucers, seize the moment and flip the broken ritual on its head, chanting a counter spell that smells of fresh rain on cobblestones. They bind Selene's own ambition to the shattered fragments, turning her into a living statue of regret, a literal stone-cold reminder of hubris. Laughter erupts from the once stoic crowd, a sound half triumph, half nervous giggle, as if the kingdom just watched the most dramatic episode of a historical reality show. The torches flare brighter, casting golden light that washes away the lingering gloom, and the scent of pine sap replaces the earlier stench of decay. Selene's eyes widen in horror as the darkness she tried to wield collapses like a poorly built Lego tower. When the dust settles, the hall stands quiet, save for the soft rustle of silk gowns and the faint drip of Myra's blood soaking into the stone, an oddly poetic reminder that legends are often written in crimson ink. The crown, now a pile of glittering shards, glints like a disco ball abandoned by a party, pretty but useless. The new queen, free from Selene's grim bargain, steps forward with a smile that could melt iron, her voice ringing like a medieval pop star hitting the high note. The kingdom breathes a collective sigh, tasting fresh air for the first time in ages, as if someone finally opened a window after a century of stale perfume. And somewhere in the shadows, A minstrel hums a tongue-in-cheek ballad about a heroine who broke a crown and saved the day, proving that even in darkness, a little blood-stained beauty can steal the spotlight. When the last blade clanged against the stone, the bloodied arena fell into a hush louder than a monk's chant. The scent of iron mingled with the sweet rot of spilled mead, making the air taste like overcooked dragon ribs. Townsfolk gathered in ragged cloaks, their eyes glistening with tears and the faint glitter of spilled jewels. Even the crows, those perpetual paparazzi of the sky, perched in solemn silence, as if waiting for a retake. From the shattered dais rose a council of scribes, merchants, and one bewildered baker who'd never voted for a queen before. They swapped the old tradition of blood inheritance for a spreadsheet of virtues, ticking boxes like a medieval HR department. The parchment they consulted crackled with the sound of ambition, and a hushed murmur spread. "We'll choose a ruler, not a sacrifice." A collective sigh rose, half relief, half the realization that no one had to stand in a vat of ichor ever again. Soon the legend of the bloodied beauty pageant turned into the kingdom's equivalent of an old horror movie, talked about in taverns over ale, with exaggerated shrieks and a few giggles. Folks likened the old contests to a medieval version of The Bachelor, except the roses were replaced with razor-sharp crowns, and the final rose ceremony was a literal bloodbath. The story became a cautionary bedtime tale for children, warning them that glitter can hide a razor blade. Even the bards, who once sang gloriously of the crimson crowns, now performed soft lullabies about peace and proper paperwork. Deep beneath the castle's catacombs, the dark rituals were sealed within a stone vault embossed with a warning. No more pretty faces, only pretty policies. The iron door groaned like a tired dragon waking from a nap, releasing a whiff of stale incense and rusted steel. Inside, shackles lay abandoned like relics from a bad reality TV show, and the walls echoed with a faint, ghostly sigh, like the audience collectively exhaling after a season finale. The kingdom's new guardians swore never to turn the key again, lest they summon the old chaos for a sequel nobody wanted. As dawn painted the towers gold, the kingdom awoke to a sunrise that smelled of fresh bread and the faint metallic tang of a past gone quiet. Citizens marched to market squares with banners that read "Queens by Council, not by Carnage," waving them like oversized fans at a rock concert. The air buzzed with optimism, punctuated by the occasional chuckle of an old guard recalling the absurdity of choosing royalty with a ballot instead of a blade. And so, the dark pageants became a footnote, sealed away like an unwanted spoiler, while the realm stepped into a new era of governance, one that could finally focus on real beauty. Good governance, good ale, and perhaps a decent haircut for the queen. Year of the Red Plague painted the countryside in a grim, scarlet hue, making every sunrise feel like a bad filter on a medieval Instagram. King Aldrich, whose crown shone like a tarnished helmet from a bad fantasy video game, convened his council in the damp stone hall. He slammed a wax-sealed parchment onto the oak table and declared, in a voice that could rattle the chapel bells, that the realm must be cleansed by water. The edict, stiff as a freshly forged sword, ordered every peasant to bathe in the river at dawn, lest divine wrath turn their throats to rust. Thus, the royal decree rippled through the villages like a cold shock to the spine, promising salvation through shivering immersion. When the town crier's hammer echoed across the hamlet, The villagers gathered as if for a market, only to hear the king's latest fashion advice. Take a dip or die. Old Marta, who kept a pet goat named Bessie that smelled of barnyard jazz, scoffed, muttering that she'd rather wrestle a dragon than a trout. The men grumbled, slapping their leather belts, while the women clutched hand-woven shawls, fearing the cold would turn their toes into icicles. A traveling jester, never one to miss a joke, whispered, "Soon we'll have more splash than Netflix binge-watching." And the crowd cracked a weary grin. Yet the decree carried the weight of a sword-clad surf lord, and even the most stubborn boy, who had once tried to sell the king a dragon-free certificate, obeyed. At the first pale light, the river gurgled like a kettle left on a medieval stove, its surface slick with algae and the faint scent of mud pie. Peasants stripped down with the speed of circus acrobats, exposing thighs that had known only the rough kiss of pine logs and the occasional stray chicken. The water slapped their skin, a chilling slap dance that made them gasp louder than a tavern brawl, while the cold seeped into their bones and made their breath form tiny clouds. Laughter, shrill and nervous, mixed with the squelch of boots on soggy stones, and the riverbank echoed with the chorus of splashing bodies and disgruntled swearing. Even the river's fish seemed to roll their eyes, as if saying, "Here comes the human laundry. No one asked for a rinse." King Aldrich, perched on his throne in the great hall, claimed the icy plunge was a gift from the Almighty, a divine detox that would banish the pestilence like a cheat code in a video game. He cited holy texts that spoke of water cleansing sin, though the only thing being cleansed appeared to be the peasant's dignity and a few stubborn fleas. The irony dripped hotter than the river's surface. While the king's beard shone with freshly polished oil, the common folk shivered like characters frozen in a Game of Thrones winter. A priest, trying to sound solemn, whispered that the river was a holy bathtub, and a nearby monk muttered under his breath that it felt more like a medieval cold shower commercial. The decree's logic swam in circles, yet the kingdom's folk obeyed, hoping the splash would melt the red plague away like butter on a hot skillet. By noon, the riverbank smelled of wet wool, sour sweat, and the unmistakable tang of fear, a perfume no noble scented candle could mask. Peasants trudged back to their cottages, shivering in layers of wool that clung to chilled skin, their feet squishing in mud like soggy biscuits. The king's promise of divine protection felt as flimsy as a leaky bucket. But the people, now tingling from the cold, whispered that perhaps the true cure was a good, hard laugh at the absurdity. Children, their cheeks pink from the chill, pretended the river was a dragon's breath, hissing fire, and then promptly slipping on the slick stones to uproarious applause. Thus the kingdom learned that a royal edict could turn a simple river into a stage for comedy, tragedy, and the most honest, if icy, cleansing the age had ever known. At dawn, the village wells empty their night-long silence into a frothing ribbon of river, and the peasants shuffle forward like a line of reluctant actors on a frozen stage. Their boots splash clank against the icy current, sending tiny spray arches that glitter like broken glass. The water bites their calves, making every step feel like a cold-handed slap from a disgruntled troll. Above the roar of the rush, the wind whistles through the thatch, carrying the sour scent of damp wool and the lingering musk of yesterday's goat stew. Yet no one dares linger. The Lord's decree, as rigid as the stone bridge, demands they cleanse before the sun climbs high. Sir Aldrich, the steward with a moustache as sharp as his ledger, patrols the banks with a wooden staff that doubles as a ruler for punishment. He barked, "Delay and you shall forfeit a chicken," a threat that sent shivers higher than the river itself. When one burly lad tried to justify his tardiness with a tale of a broken bucket, Aldrich snatched the boy's mud-splattered shirt and tossed it into the stream as a public example. The crowd winced, not just from the cold, but from the knowledge that the steward's fines could empty a pantry faster than a raven stealing crumbs. In that moment, the river became less a cleansing rite and more a courtroom where every splash echoed a verdict. The villagers clutched their simple tools, an oar, a cracked ladle, a rusted bucket, like lifelines, but the thin woolen cloaks they wear do little to fend off the chill. Their breath fogs in the air, forming ghostly clouds that mingle with the river's spray, creating a misty veil that smells of peat and damp earth. When they plunge, the shock sends a jolt through their muscles, turning hands white and making their hearts pound like a drum in a tavern skirmish. The water's current pulls at their ankles, tugging at the frayed cords of their boots, while the distant clatter of the mill's wheel provides a rhythmic, almost sarcastic, accompaniment. Even the river seems to grin, its surface rippling with a mischievous gleam, as if it knows the irony of forcing a filthy folk to become even dirtier in spirit. Imagine a medieval version of a tick-tock cold plunge challenge, except the only followers are a dozen cackling peasants and a stern steward who refuses to hashtag his punishments. One farmer, cheeks rosy from the shock, jokes, "If only we could live-stream this, the Lord might spare a penny for the views." The crowd chuckles, their laughter bubbling up like a hot spring beneath the ice, but the steward's glare freezes the mirth faster than a winter frost. The humor, thin as frost bite, is a thin shield against the reality that a missed bath could mean losing a newborn lamb or a sack of rye. In that absurd tableau, the river becomes a stage where comedy and cruelty perform a twisted duet. By sunset the villagers emerge, dripping and shivering, yet oddly refreshed as if they'd been baptized by the very elements that threatened to drown them. Their skin glistens with a sheen of river mud, a badge of survival that the steward proudly notes in his ledger alongside the collected fines. The cold lingers in their bones, but so does a stubborn pride that no edict can wash away. They gather around the communal fire, trading stories of the day's icy ordeal while the flames crackle, casting warm shadows that flicker like hopeful spirits. In the end, the river's ruthless embrace forged a community tougher than the iron spikes on the Lord's gate, proving that even the cruelest hygiene edicts can't freeze the human heart. Snow still clung to the roofs when Etta's tale of the hidden spring spread like wildfire across the valley, warming the villagers more than any hearth. Her discovery came just as the river turned savage, a churning monster that foamed and cracked with sheets of ice. People whispered that the spring was a gift from the earth to save them from the king's foolish decree. The more the river bellowed, the more the spring gleamed in their minds like a candle in a crypt. Even the sheep seemed to sense the shift, bleating nervously whenever the river thundered too loud. The steward, Aldrich, doubled his patrols, barking threats louder than before, yet his voice sounded hollow against the roar of the floodwaters. The peasants, shivering in their patched cloaks, now carried not just buckets, but also Etta's whispered defiance in their hearts. Around fires, they laughed at the absurdity of bathing in a river that smelled of rotten fish and swampy socks. If the king wants us clean, why doesn't he bathe in this stew himself? They joked, and the laughter felt sharper, more dangerous than ever. It was rebellion, wrapped in humor and warmed by hope. When the flood finally spilled across the lowland, dragging reeds, straw, and even a bleeding goat, the villagers felt their anger crystallize like ice on the window panes. They no longer muttered in secret groves. They marched together, boots crunching in unison, toward the guardhouse. Etta walked among them, clutching nothing but a ladle, as if daring fate to mock their poverty. The villagers were no longer just subjects obeying an edict. They had become a chorus, a noisy choir demanding warmth against the cold tyranny of river baths. Their breath rose like banners in the air, defiance made visible. The guards tried to recite laws, parchment crackling in their trembling hands, but the words drowned under the roar of the crowd. Marla, the scar-faced peasant with a voice like a church bell, shouted what everyone thought, that no one should suffer frostbite in the name of purity. Her defiance braided perfectly with Etta's rumors, creating a story bigger than either of them. Laughter broke the ice between fear and fury, as villagers mocked the king with tales of him bathing in frozen peas or lounging in hot wine while his subjects froze. Even the guards cracked nervous smiles, knowing the law was cracking, too. By the time the river calmed, the valley had changed forever. A banner fluttered above the square declaring, "No more cold baths," a slogan that was half joke, half revolution. The peasants cheered, their lungs steaming clouds of victory, while the guards slunk away with embarrassment clinging to their armor. The hidden spring remained their quiet sanctuary, proof that the land itself had taken their side. And when they told the tale years later, they always began with Etta's discovery and ended with Marla's defiance, a chain of courage that turned icy suffering into warm laughter and lasting freedom. The winter draped the valley in a shivering white blanket, and the river, normally a lazy, glassy ribbon, thundered like a dragon awoken. Ice clung to every fence post, and the scent of damp peat rose from the mud like a cheap perfume. Peasants huddled in their timber shacks, teeth chattering as they tried to keep the royal edict's promise of cold river baths fresh in their memory. Their only entertainment was watching the river's angry swell, a spectacle that made even the hardest mule wince. In the flickering firelight, old Tomas muttered that the king's hygiene law felt like a medieval version of a reality TV stunt. When the flood broke, water surged over the lowland like a massive, shivering wave, dragging reeds, straw, and a stray goat that shouted moo, like a startled teenager in a horror movie. The roar was a deafening drumbeat that rattled windows and sent shivers down the spines of every man, woman, and child who dared step outside. The icy torrent smelled of rotting fish and earthy bitterness, a reminder that bathing in it would be less spa day and more plunge into an unsanitary nightmare. Villagers clutched their wooden buckets, half expecting a miracle, half fearing a cold shock that would lock their joints for life. Yet the flood also carried a strange solidarity, as if the river itself were screaming, "Enough." Bundled together like a ragtag superhero squad, the peasants stalked toward the guardhouse, the snow crunching under their boots like a marching band of squeaky shoes. They brandished pitchforks and frying pans, improvised weapons that gleamed with a mix of desperation and irony, while shouting, "We demand a thaw!" The royal guards, accustomed to issuing edicts and polishing armor, looked as bewildered as a cat watching a laser pointer. Their steel helmets clanged against the frosty wind, and a nervous sergeant tried to recite the law, only to choke on a breath of icy air. The clash of authority and frostbitten anger echoed across the valley, a chorus louder than any winter hymn. One brave peasant, a wiry woman named Marla with a scar shaped like a question mark, stepped forward and declared, "If you want us clean, send us warm baths, not Antarctic torture chambers." Her words cut through the cold like a sword made of sunlight, and even the most stoic guard cracked a grin, thinking of the absurdity of forcing peasants to dunk in a river that smelled like a swampy gym locker. The commander, sweating despite the freeze, tried to justify the edict by citing old parchment that mentioned purity of spirit, a phrase that now felt as stale as week-old bread. Laughter bubbled among the crowd, mingling with the river's roar, as someone joked that the king must have taken a bath in a tub of frozen peas. The guards, half amused and half embarrassed, whispered about sending a messenger to the crown with a request for hot springs. The air crackled with a tension that tasted like burnt pine and the fresh promise of rebellion. In the end, the flood receded, leaving behind a carpet of slick ice and a new banner fluttering above the village square. "No more cold baths, except when the king wants us to be Vikings." The peasants cheered, their breath forming clouds that looked like applause, while the royal guards slunk away, clutching their helmets like guilty teenagers hiding a broken phone. The river, now a sluggish, murky mirror, reflected their triumph with a glint that said, "You tried, but you can't stop the water from flowing, just like you can't stop a meme from spreading." As the sun finally pierced the gray sky, the valley smelled of wet stone and fresh hope, and even the goats seemed to grin. The edict was lifted, but the memory of that icy showdown lingered, a story the villagers would retell beside fires for generations, each time with a chuckle and a shiver. And somewhere in the castle, a bored scribe updated the rule book, adding a footnote. "Baths shall be lukewarm, unless the king watches Netflix and feels nostalgic for Game of Thrones." The king's courtyard echoed with ragged cries as peasants plunged into icy rivers, shivering like damp laundry tossed from a storm-tossed ship. King Aldrich, swaddled in mourning robes, watched the crimson tide of fallen soldiers and realized his own edicts had turned hygiene into a grim endurance test. The law that demanded weekly cold water baptisms was supposed to purge disease, but it merely washed out hope and left a lingering stench of fear and algae. In the flicker of torchlight, the king felt the weight of every shuddering body, as if the kingdom itself were a giant, reluctant soap commercial. Irony dripped like the river's runoff. A ruler who prized purity was forcing his people to look like kelp-covered trolls. One moonless night, Aldrich summoned his council, their faces as solemn as stone gargoyles, and announced the new covenant. He proclaimed that the kingdom would trade the frigid river for heated communal baths carved into basalt chambers, where steam would rise like dragon's breath. "No more baptisms by the frost bite," he declared, brandishing a scroll that smelled faintly of burnt rosemary, a scent he hoped would mask the lingering swamp odor. The decree balanced health and welfare, promising warmth without the tyranny of a king-imposed plague dance. The council exchanged glances, half cheering, half wondering if the king had simply watched too many medieval cooking shows where bathwater doubles as broth. The new baths rose from the earth like hulking, soot-black cauldrons, their stone walls warm to the touch, humming with the rhythm of hidden furnaces. Inside, steam curled upward, cloaking the room in a fog that smelled of boiled herbs, coal, and the faint, comforting whiff of fresh bread from the nearby bakery. Peasants stepped onto heated stone floors, their feet tingling as if 1,000 tiny fireflies marched beneath them. The water, at a temperature that made even the hardiest blacksmith sigh, rippled with bubbles that popped like gossip in the market square. Lanterns cast amber glints on wet skin, turning the once grim scene into a medieval spa that could make even a dragon blush. At first, the villagers eyed the baths with the suspicion of cats near a fresh fish pond, muttering jokes about king-size hot tubs, fit for a Game of Thrones feast. Yet as the steam cleared, laughter rose, mingling with the splash of water and the occasional clatter of a dropped wooden bucket, an orchestra of relief. One farmer, nicknamed Grim Beard, emerged dripping, shouting that the warmth felt like a hug from a giant, slightly sweaty bear. The irony was palpable. The same law that once forced them into shivering rivers now offered a communal sanctuary where gossip flowed freer than the river's current. Even the local bard began composing a ballad, dubbing the baths Aldrich's Jacuzzi of Justice, much to the delight of children who squealed while chasing suds. Months later, the kingdom's mortality charts resembled a rising sun, not a blood-red eclipse, as fevers waned and spirits rose. The heated chambers became social hubs where elders shared recipes, youths debated the latest tapestry designs, and lovers whispered promises amidst the hiss of steam. King Aldrich, now slightly less solemn, would stroll among the baths, his crown glinting like a water droplet on a leaf, taking a moment to inhale the soothing aroma of rosemary and fresh water. The new covenant proved that a ruler's humility could turn a tyrannical edict into a public good, balancing the harshness of medieval life with a splash of comfort. In the end, the kingdom learned that sometimes the best way to cleanse a soul is with a warm soak, not an icy plunge, plus a dash of royal benevolence and a sprinkle of humor. The great hall of Chateau de Lys rumbled with the clamor of armor and gossip, as torchlight flickered against stained glass saints. Sir Aldrich of Montfort, his visor polished to a glare that could blind a moth, stepped onto the cold stone dais. The king's herald, a rotund man with a voice like a tolling bell, unfurled a vellum scroll scented of mildew and ink. With the crowd's breath hanging like a humid curtain, Aldrich placed his gauntleted hand upon the oath, feeling the wooden planks rasp under his grip. Somewhere outside, a street vendor shouted about fresh rabbit stew, a reminder that even noble drama can't drown out frying fat. He swore to protect the weak, a promise that sounded as lofty as a mountain goat leaping over a chapel roof. He pledged to uphold justice, though his definition of justice still involved a sword that sang like a metal-crazed electric guitar. And he vowed to wield his blade only in the name of honor, a notion as sparkling as a freshly polished shield, if you ignore the occasional splatter of blood. The court chuckled, whispering that the oath might be as sturdy as a cardboard armor, but Aldrich's eyes glittered like a knight in shining anime gear. In that moment, the irony of chivalry, heroic on paper, potentially barbaric in practice, hung as heavy as the king's jeweled crown. Down the cobbled lanes of Lierre, merchants paused their haggling, the smell of roasted hazelnuts mixing with horse dung. Children perched on barrel lids, eyes wide as saucers, while old women clutched rosaries and whispered prayers for a knight who won't steal our cheese. The town's fountain, usually a babbling gossip hub, fell silent as if waiting for a hero to splash in its cool waters. A wandering minstrel strummed a lute, turning Aldrich's oath into a jaunty ditty that sounded suspiciously like a medieval tick-tock trend. Hope fluttered in the market like a moth trapped behind a stained glass window, bright, fragile, and prone to a sudden, messy crash. Weeks later, the first plea for aid arrived. A farmer's daughter, bruised and trembling, claimed a band of marauding thieves had stolen her livestock. Aldrich rode in, armor clanking like a percussion section, and declared justice with a thunderous shout that startled even the town's cats. Rather than negotiate, he ordered the thieves bound to a wooden stake, their faces illuminated by torchlight as the crowd watched the gruesome justice unfold. The execution was swift, the sword slicing through sinew with the satisfying thud of a butcher's cleaver, and the air filled with the coppery tang of fresh blood, a perfume no noble perfume would dare replicate. As the townsfolk cheered, a few whispered that perhaps the white rose had turned a shade of crimson, proving that chivalry's noble veneer can melt into barbarism faster than butter on a summer hearth. By the time the sun set behind Lierre's crooked rooftops, the oath's parchment lay damp with sweat and the occasional stray tear. Aldrich, now covered in grime and the scent of victory, lifted his visor to meet the eyes of a little girl who asked, "Sir Knight, will you ever be gentle like a lamb?" He answered with a half-smile, the kind you'd see on a superhero who's just realized his cape is a towel soaked in mud. The irony, like a well-worn gauntlet, fit snugly around his heart. The promise to protect could sometimes feel more like a heavy, rusty chain. And so the white rose, once a symbol of pure chivalry, fluttered in the wind, petals soft yet edged with the faint, unmistakable scent of iron. The summer sun wilted over Lierre like a tired superhero after a marathon, and the fields yawned empty, the stalks curled into skeletal fingers. Rumors of famine curled through the town like gossip at a royal banquet, and the granaries, once proud vaults of golden grain, sat hollow, echoing with the hollow sighs of starving mothers. Into this gloom marched a ragged band of mercenaries, their armor dented, their banners stained with mud, eyes glittering like bargain bin villains from a low-budget fantasy flick. They thumped the gates of the granary with boots that clanged like a dying drum line, shouting that hunger was no excuse for a hero's patience. The townsfolk, gaunt and desperate, watched as the marauders began to pry open the doors, their silhouettes casting grotesque shadows over the wheatless shelves. Sir Aldrich, a knight whose armor still smelled faintly of pine-scented polish, spurred his chestnut steed and burst onto the scene with a clamor that could wake the dead. At his heel waddled Tomas, a squire whose enthusiasm outpaced his clumsy coordination, clutching a lance that looked more like a broom handle than a weapon of war. They charged through the dust, swords flashing, while the mercenaries snarled like alley cats that had run out of fish. Sparks sprayed as steel met steel, and the air filled with the coppery perfume of blood mingling with the sour stench of sweat and stale bread. For a heartbeat, it seemed chivalry might actually save the harvest, until the king's messenger arrived on a pigeon-like courier, bearing a decree that turned the battlefield into a theatrical tragedy. The royal edict was as clear as a meme caption. All captured foes shall be punished publicly, lest their suffering be forgotten. Aldrich read the parchment, his brow furrowing like a worried Wi-Fi signal trying to connect, and felt his honor wobble like a Jenga tower in an earthquake. The king, perched on his throne like a bored reality show judge, demanded a display that would scare the peasants into obedience and the enemies into never returning. Thus, the very knights who had sworn to protect the weak were ordered to turn their victory into a macabre carnival of hanging and flaying. The irony hung heavier than the rope they were about to use, and even the wind seemed to sigh. "This is not what I signed up for," as if the fields themselves were rolling their eyes. The crowd gathered at the granary's stone courtyard, a sea of gaunt faces illuminated by torches that flickered like nervous Instagram filters. Chains clanged, ropes sang a grim lullaby, and the first captive, a burly mercenary with a scar shaped like a question mark, was hoisted aloft, his screams cracking the night like a broken vinyl record. When the flaying began, the scent of hot flesh and charred oil rose, mingling with the faint perfume of wilted herbs, a nauseating perfume that made even the bravest knight's stomach churn. Tomas, eyes wide as a cartoon character's, tried to steady his hands, but his grip slipped, and a strip of skin peeled away with a squelch that sounded suspiciously like popcorn popping under a magnifying glass. Yet amid the gore, a lone minstrel whistled a jaunty tune from Game of Thrones, as if daring the gods to critique the absurdity of knights who turned rescue into a reality TV execution show. When the last rope snapped and the final flayed hide hung like a grotesque tapestry, silence settled over Lierre, heavy as a tombstone at a superhero funeral. Sir Aldrich lowered his sword, its blade dulled not by rust but by the weight of ironic shame, and whispered to Tomas that honor, when strangled by orders, becomes as useless as a Wi-Fi router in a stone castle. The townsfolk, eyes glazed with both terror and relief, shuffled back to their empty hearths, tasting the bitter aftertaste of victory seasoned with guilt. In the weeks that followed, the king's decree was whispered about like an urban legend, and the granaries, though still empty, became a shrine to a lesson that chivalry can easily be repackaged as barbaric theater. And so the harvest, though still barren, sprouted a new crop. The bitter seed of irony, harvested with a grin, a sigh, and a reminder that even the noblest armor can't shield a soul from a bad script. The early morning mist curled around the thatched huts of Willowmere like a forget-me-not blanket, and Myra stood in the village square with mud caked in her skirts. A gaunt boy from the neighboring manor had withered to death, his belly an empty drum, and the superstitious folk whispered that Myra's herbs had cursed him. The town's gossip, as sour as sourdough left out in rain, painted her as a witch who fed on children's sighs. Even the old sexton, who smelled forever of incense and stale ale, pointed a trembling finger and shouted, "She brewed the famine." The accusation hung in the air, heavy as a sack of iron coins. Sir Aldrich, a knight whose coat of arms shone with the silver stag of his house, rode in on a chestnut steed, his visor reflecting the pallid sunrise. His code, etched into his very marrow, mandated the protection of the innocent, a promise he recited daily like a prayer before breakfast. Yet the murmurs of the council swirled around him like angry wasps, each buzz demanding a spectacle to scare the peasants into silence. He glanced at Myra, seeing the tremor in her hands, and felt his heart pound louder than a war drum. The irony that his noble oath would soon be tested, by the very cruelty it condemned, began to gnaw at his conscience. The council, a squat assembly of rotund men who smelled of sweat and stale pork, convened beneath an overgrown oak and voted for a public execution, as if they were casting a Netflix binge-watch of medieval gore. "Let her be burned," declared Lord Marwick, his voice cracking like a cracked shield, "that the children stop dreaming of witchcraft." The decree called for her to be strapped to the pyre, the wood soaked in goat fat, the flames licking her like an overzealous dragon on a barbecue. Aldrich tried to argue, his words spilling out like clumsy peasants' curses, but the council laughed, their mirth echoing off the stone walls like a cruel chorus. The crowd, ravenous for spectacle, cheered, turning the village square into a theater of blood and smoke. Bound by oath and chained by duty, Aldrich was ordered to stand beside the pyre, his gauntleted hand trembling as the fire hissed and spat sparks that smelled of burnt hair and charred leather. The heat rolled over his armor like a furnace, searing his cheekbones, while the crowd's chants rose in a discordant hymn that sounded suspiciously like a medieval remix of "Let It Burn." He watched Myra's eyes widen, the tears glistening like dew on a spider's web before the flames devoured her shawl, each crackle a reminder of the cruelty hidden behind chivalrous banners. Inside, his shield of honor cracked, splintering into shards of guilt that pierced his thoughts sharper than any sword. The irony stared back at him, a grotesque jest. The knight sworn to shield the weak now bore witness to the very barbarism his order once vowed to abolish. When the ashes finally settled, Aldrich felt the weight of 1,000 embarrassed emojis flashing in his mind, as if the universe had just given him a thumbs down on a medieval tick-tock. He whispered a promise to the wind, swearing never again to let politics dictate justice, even if that meant challenging the council's love for drama worthy of a reality show finale. The villagers dispersed, their faces smeared with soot, muttering about the day the night became a spectator sport. Aldrich lifted his visor, the morning sun glittering off his dented helm like a shattered mirror, and walked away with the solemn swagger of someone who had just watched his own code get roasted. In the end, the true lesson rang clearer than any battle cry. Chivalry, when it wears a robe of showmanship, often ends up looking as naked and absurd as a court jester in a knight's armor. The great hall swelled with incense and trumpet blares as King Aldrich lifted his crown, its gold glinting like a fresh Instagram filter. Peasants clapped, nobles whispered, and the scent of roasted boar mingled with the oily perfume of nervous sweat. Suddenly, the doors cracked open, and a ragtag band of rebels surged in, their banners flapping like angry seagulls. Their leader, a wiry man with a scar shaped like a question mark, shouted an oath that sounded like a mixtape of angry punk lyrics. The crowd gasped, and the coronation turned from pageantry to a scene straight out of a medieval Game of Thrones episode. Aldrich's loyal knights sprang into action, steel flashing under the chandelier's crystal tiers. The clatter of swords rang louder than the hall's organ, each strike echoing like a drum solo in a rock concert. Blood splattered the polished marble, turning it a vivid shade of scarlet that even the most seasoned butchers would admire. The rebels fought back with crude axes, their grunts and curses filling the air like a heated argument on a reality TV show. Yet the knights held their ground, their polished armor clanking in rhythm with their hearts pounding like war drums. Just as the melee reached its crescendo, a royal scribe burst onto the scene, unfurling a parchment that read, in all caps, "Rebel quarters to be lived." The decree demanded the insurgents be held captive in the very rooms they stormed, a barbaric twist that made the term quartering sound like a twisted spa treatment. Knights exchanged bewildered glances, their code of chivalry suddenly feeling as flimsy as a paper crown. The rebels were forced to sit on their own thrones, the smell of damp stone and fear mixing with the lingering scent of boiled cabbage. The irony dripped thicker than the wine spilling across the floor, turning honor into a cruel joke. When the rebel leader tried to rally his men, Aldrich stepped forward, his famed sword, once a symbol of noble virtue, gleaming in the candlelight like a lightsaber at a Renaissance fair. With a single, practiced swing, he cleaved the man's head from his shoulders, the blade singing a grim lullaby as it split flesh and bone. The air filled with the metallic tang of fresh blood and the faint, sweet smell of crushed rosemary from the thrown dagger. The crowd fell silent, the horror of the act splintering Aldrich's belief that chivalry could ever shield him from savagery. In that moment, his sword felt less like a promise and more like a guillotine at a medieval carnival. Sweat-soaked and blood-streaked, Aldrich stared at the dripping hilt of his once hallowed weapon, feeling the weight of hypocrisy settle on his shoulders like a bad costume. He realized that the cloak of knightly honor was as thin as a parchment scroll in a rainstorm, easily torn when politics demanded blood. The rebels were herded into the same stone chambers they had tried to seize, the smell of fear now mingling with the dank, earthy scent of damp walls. As the hall emptied, a lone minstrel began to strum a mournful lute, sounding eerily like the opening bars of a modern horror movie soundtrack. Aldrich left the throne room with a grim grin, knowing that the only true chivalry now was surviving the next episode of his own twisted saga. The night the battlefield stank of iron and charred pine still haunts Sir Aldrich, its echo a ragged drum in his mind. He stripped his gauntlet-clad arms of the title, sir, tossing the heavy crest into a ditch where the mud swallowed it whole. Stumbling back to Lierre, he felt the cobblestones bite his tired boots like a skeptical audience at a bad comedy show. The wind carried the distant whine of wounded men, a reminder that honor, when wielded like a broadsword, can slice the very soul it tries to protect. In Lierre's heart, Aldrich erected a sanctuary that smelled less of smoke and more of fresh herbs, rosemary and lavender battling the lingering scent of blood. The stone walls, once destined for a war hall, now cradled candlelight that flickered like a timid Instagram filter. Children chased each other through the cloisters, their laughter clashing with the solemn clang of armor that had been repurposed as a cooking pot. It was a place where mercy replaced spectacle, and the only duels were of song verses, not swords, think The Good Place, but with fewer fluorescent lights and more thatched roofs. Aldrich gathered the few remaining squires and taught them to stitch wounds, not to notch helmets. He demonstrated how a gentle press on a fevered brow could be more heroic than a thunderous charge, each lesson punctuated by the hiss of boiling broth and the sour tang of disinfectant herbs. The novices, initially as stiff as medieval mannequins, learned to offer a warm loaf of bread as a shield against hunger, not a blade against an enemy. It felt oddly like a medieval version of a hug therapist, less Game of Thrones, more Ted Lasso with chainmail. Word spread faster than a gossiping minstrel, and the old order scoffed, calling Aldrich a cowardly peacock for swapping steel for soup bowls. Former comrades muttered that honor was a show, not a charity, and that his sanctuary smelled too much like a spa and not enough like battle. Yet when a wounded knight staggered in, clutching a shattered lance, and found shelter under Aldrich's roof, The irony cut deeper than any sword. The very men who mocked mercy now needed it. Their armor clanged like a dying sitcom laugh track as they knelt to receive bandages, the sound oddly comforting in its own clumsy way. As dawn painted the sanctuary's courtyard with gold, the scent of fresh bread mingled with the distant roar of a war drum, a reminder that the world outside still spins its violent tale. Aldrich stood atop the stone steps, eyes bright, proclaiming that true honor lies not in grand vows shouted from a balcony, but in the quiet compassion that breaks a cycle of ironies. The crowd, a motley mix of peasants, former knights, and curious cats, responded with a chorus of soft murmurs, the kind that could lull a dragon to sleep. In that moment, the new dawn of mercy shone, proving that the fiercest battles are sometimes fought with kindness, not cruelty. When the first gray tendrils of dawn crept over Lyria, the valley smelled of damp earth and wilted rye, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Young scribe Aaron, ink-stained fingers still trembling from the night's cold, was summoned by the elder, a wiry man whose beard smelled faintly of tobacco and old parchment. The elder's voice rasped like a wind-swept reed, urging Aaron to record a law older than the stone walls that cradled their farms. Around them, crows cackled, scattering droppings that glistened like tiny obsidian beads on the moss. Aaron felt a shiver, not from the chill, but from the weight of a tale that had never been written down. The law, embossed on a cracked slate, commanded that every corpse be nailed to its coffin with iron spikes, each nail hammered in until the wood sang a low, metallic thud. Then the mouth, no matter how gurgling or grinning, was sealed with a lump of wax, scented with lavender to hush any lingering whispers. Villagers swore this ritual bound restless spirits, preventing them from prowling the fields and stealing the golden harvest. The elder explained that a single unnailed finger could unleash a phantom that would gnaw the stalks from the inside, like a pestilent version of the Game of Thrones, White Walkers, only less flashy and more smelly. Aaron scribbled furiously, his quills scratching the edge of history like a hungry rabbit. The burial ground lay beneath a canopy of twisted oaks, their branches dripping sap that smelled of bitter tea. As the pallbearers hoisted the coffin, the scent of stale linen mingled with the metallic tang of blood that had not yet fully dried. The master carpenter raised his hammer, and each iron nail sank with a clang that echoed off the hillside, rattling the nearby beehives into a frantic buzz. When the wax was poured, it hissed, sealing the dead's jaw with a ghost-like sheen that caught the waning sun. The crowd held their breath, eyes wide, as if any stray whisper might sprout into a scream that would wilt the wheat. If any outsider had watched the scene, they'd have thought it a medieval version of a zombie apocalypse sitcom. Think, The Walking Dead meets a farmer's market, only the zombies are politely kept on a leash of iron. The irony was not lost on the townsfolk, who laughed nervously while patting the freshly nailed coffin, muttering that even the dead needed a good manicure. A child slipped a pebble into the wax, giggling as it clinked like a tiny bell, unaware that the elders believed such mischief could awaken a grumpy spirit with a taste for midnight snacks. Yet the ritual persisted, a blend of superstition and communal theater, each act performed with the solemnity of a Shakespearean curtain call. The smell of hot iron lingered, reminding everyone that even myths have a scorch mark. When Aaron finally set his quill down, the valley seemed to breathe a little easier, as if the newly bound spirits were content to watch the sunrise from their iron-clad perches. He felt a strange pride, like a script editor who just nailed the perfect plot twist, knowing his ink would guide generations of harvesters. The elder placed a hand on Aaron's shoulder, the skin rough as bark, and whispered that the law was less about fear and more about honoring the dead's right to a quiet exit. In the distance, the wheat swayed, whispering its own secret gratitude, while a lone crow perched atop the oak, perhaps the only creature exempt from the nails. And so the whispering graves of Lyria earned their name, a chorus of muted voices that kept the fields green and the villagers oddly amused. A bitter wind whistled through the low hills of Keldar, rattling the thatched roofs like a bad hair day for the gods. Aaron stalked the wilted rye, his boots squelching in mud that reeked of rot and stale onions. A strange illness had crept through the fields, turning the golden grain into a sickly gray, and the villagers swore they could taste death on the wind. Children coughed in unison, their throats sounding like busted accordion bellows, while elders muttered curses that would make a Shakespearean tragedy blush. In the distance, the village well burped a plume of foul steam, as if the earth itself were trying to regurgitate something forbidden. Word spread faster than gossip at a market about the Othmer family, who had defied the ancient burial rite and left their dead kin unsealed in the family crypt. The Othmers, stubborn as donkeys on a hill, claimed the dead were merely sleeping, not dying, a notion that made Aaron's stomach churn like a cauldron of sour milk. When the village priest finally pried the stone slab ajar, a cloud of putrid incense rose, carrying the scent of decayed figs and the quiet sigh of 100 sighing souls. The unburied bodies lay twisted, their limbs draped in moth-eaten shrouds, eyes staring blankly at a sky that had forgotten to be blue. Irony dripped from the scene like cheap ketchup on a gourmet burger. The living had tried to cheat death, only to hand it a backstage pass. Soon, the villagers gathered in the square, pointing trembling fingers at the restless silhouettes drifting beyond the graveyard fence. "It's the wandering dead," shouted old Merrick, his voice cracking like a cracked pot, and the crowd roared in agreement as if they'd just seen the latest episode of a horror binge. Children huddled behind their mothers, clutching wooden toys that squeaked in protest, while the men brandished pitchforks like misplaced props from a medieval cosplay. The air grew thick with fear, a palpable humidity that made everyone's hair stand on end, and even the livestock seemed to hold their breath, eyes wide with a terror usually reserved for fireworks on New Year's Eve. The irony, of course, was that no one mentioned the Othmers' defiance, preferring instead to blame the unseen specters, because blaming ghosts is cheaper than paying a funeral director. By the week's end, the crops had wilted into a despondent carpet of brown, each stalk snapping under the weight of an invisible curse like a tired actor dropping his script. The scent of rot mingled with the sweet fragrance of wilted lavender, creating a perfume that could have inspired the most avant-garde perfumer in Paris, if Paris still existed. Birds fell from the sky in a slow, mournful cascade, their feathers fluttering like shredded confetti at a funeral parade. The villagers whispered that the dead were gnawing at the roots, pulling nutrients like toddlers tugging at their parents' shoelaces, while the wind carried distant moans that sounded suspiciously like an old dial-up modem trying to connect to the afterlife. Aaron, standing amid the ruin, felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on his back, each one demanding answers he didn't have. except maybe a decent joke about how the dead really know how to party in underground venues. When the moon rose, pale and unforgiving, Aaron gathered the reluctant villagers around a crackling fire that smelled of smoked pork and desperation. He recited the forgotten verses of the burial rite, his voice cutting through the night like a lightsaber in a dark hallway, and the unsealed bodies began to stir, their movements sluggish as if waking from a decade-long nap. One by one, the dead slipped back into their earth-bound cradles, sighing as if relieved to finally get a night off from haunting. The curse lifted like a bad Netflix binge ending, and the fields, though still muddy, breathed a tentative sigh of renewal. In the aftermath, the Othmer family swore never again to question tradition, except perhaps to ask why the gods didn't give them a better Wi-Fi signal up here. Aaron stepped onto the cold stone dais, his parchment trembling like a nervous cat, and began to unfurl the grisly statistics of the Iron Nail Ordinance. The council chamber smelled of burnt sage and stale ale, while torches sputtered shadows that danced like jittery ghosts. He pointed at a charcoal sketch of a freshly driven nail through a corpse, describing how the rust soaked into bones and invited disease like a leaky faucet. The audience hissed, some faces flushed red as the sun at high noon, but a few younger members leaned forward, curious as kids watching a slime-filled slime ball. Aaron's voice, sharp as a scythe, cut through the incense haze, urging a reconsideration before the living fell victim to the dead's rust. The magistrate, a burly man whose beard could hide a small goat, thumped his gavel and barked that tradition was the backbone of the kingdom, not some soggy notebook. He accused Aaron of heresy, saying the young scholar was tempting the gods like a pizza-topping experiment gone wrong. "Your ideas are as rotten as last month's cheese," he snarled, his eyes flickering like candle flames caught in a draft. The council murmured, the sound like a swarm of beetles in a pantry, and the priesthood nodded, their robes rustling like old parchment. Aaron felt the weight of their scorn, pressing down like a sack of iron nails on his chest. The high priest, draped in embroidered vestments that smelled faintly of myrrh and mildew, invoked the ancient covenant that the dead must be shackled to keep disease at bay. He waved a ceremonial hammer, its head studded with brass, and proclaimed that without the nails, the dead would rise like the Walkman-powered zombies from a bad 80s movie. The crowd chuckled nervously, picturing corpses popping up with neon bracelets, but the priesthood clanged their chalices in solemn approval. Their chant rose, a low guttural hum that reminded Aaron of a bass line in a heavy metal concert, yet the message was clear. Disturb the nails, and you disturb the peace. Ironically, the very nails they revered were rusted through, leaking a metallic scent that tasted of fear. Without warning, the magistrate slammed the doors shut and ordered Aaron's exile, shouting that a nighttime raid would sweep him into the wilderness like a misplaced sock after laundry day. The guards brandished torches, their flames flickering like paparazzi bulbs, and the clank of their armor sounded like a junkyard symphony. Aaron could smell the wet earth and the coppery sting of fresh blood from a nearby sacrifice, a reminder that death was never far away. He was handed a tattered cloak, its hem frayed like an old meme, and a parchment promising safe passage if he could outrun the midnight hounds. The irony was thick enough to chew. The law meant to protect the living was now sending its champion into the very darkness it feared. As the council's torches dimmed, Aaron slipped into the cold night, his boots squelching in mud that smelled of rot and rebellion. He whispered a promise to the wind, promising to return with evidence that the rusted nails were a pestilence, not a protection, like a Marvel hero vowing to save the world after a messy breakup. The stars above flickered like distant eyes judging the absurdity of men who fear their own corpses. Somewhere beyond the hill, a distant howl rose, echoing the council's trembling hearts, and Aaron felt a cold grin bloom on his face. He knew the road ahead would be as twisted as a dragon's tail, but he was ready to turn the kingdom's burial laws on their head, one nail at a time. The night was colder than a witch's heart, and the town square thrummed with the hollow chant of the burial guard. Under the iron-banded law that demanded the dead stay 6 feet under, the mayor's men dragged coffins to the shallow pit, sealing them with waxed clappers that squeaked like a squeaky toy. The smell of damp earth mixed with the lingering perfume of wilted rosemary, as townsfolk whispered prayers louder than a gossip column. Lanterns flickered, casting jittery shadows that danced like jitterbugging specters on the stone walls. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the ceremony to seal the mischief forever. Suddenly, the sealed graves gave a low, mournful creak, as if the earth itself had a sore throat. Cracks spidered across the lid, and skeletal hands clawed out, dragging rotting flesh into the moonlight with a sound like old newspapers being shredded. The dead rose, eyes glazed with centuries of dust, lunging at the living with the grace of a toddler on roller skates. Screams sliced through the night, mingling with the sickly, sweet odor of decay that made even the bravest men gag. The townspeople scattered like popcorn kernels in a hot pan, tripping over barrels and each other in frantic, panicked choreography. Aaron, the town scribe with ink-stained fingers, ducked behind a cracked column, heart thudding like a war drum in a Disney musical. He watched his neighbor's hat fly off as a bony arm snapped it like a twig, then saw little Tommy clutch a wooden sword, his grin wide enough to swallow the moon. The law etched in stone tablets that read, "Never unseal the resting," echoed in his mind, a stubborn chorus of order that smelled like bureaucracy and old cheese. Yet the smell of rot and the sight of his sister's shawl being tugged from a decomposed arm twisted his gut into knots. He felt the weight of choice coil around his spine, louder than the mayor's proclamations, but quieter than his own conscience. With a breath that tasted like rust, Aaron lunged forward, ripping the waxed clappers from the graves with a yank that sounded like a vinyl record skipping. He smashed the seals, sending shards of stone scattering like confetti at a particularly grim New Year's Eve. The dead paused, blinking as if waking from a nap, then a low groan rose, a chorus of "Whoa, what the heck?" as ancient spirits realized they were no longer shackled. The air filled with a pungent mix of incense, sweat, and the unmistakable aroma of fresh-baked panic. Aaron shouted the old verse his grandmother taught him, a chant that sounded suspiciously like a karaoke rendition of "I Will Survive," and the undead began to sway, confused by the sudden switch from rage to rhythm. As the last cracked seal fell, the dead slumped back into the earth, sighing like exhausted actors after a long performance, their bodies melting into the soil with a squelch that would make a mud wrestler proud. The townsfolk, bruised and covered in a patina of dust, stared at Aaron, half in awe, half in disbelief that he'd broken the law and saved them all. The mayor, red-faced like a beet in a heat wave, muttered about fines and reform, while the town's baker offered free loaves as if peace could be baked into a baguette. Aaron, dripping with mud and triumph, laughed, a sound that cracked the night like a cheap joke in a medieval tavern. And somewhere in the distance, a lone owl hooted as if to say, "Well, that's one way to raise the dead, literally." When Aaron slipped the rose-laden handkerchief into the iron-bound casket, the stone-cold hush that had draped the council hall shattered like a busted goblet. The dead, long held in uneasy suspension, seemed to sigh and settle, their rattling chains finally loosening as if a phantom exhaled. Whispered gasps rippled through the assembled magistrates, half relief, half terror, as the smell of rust gave way to a faint earthiness. Even the candle flames, which had flickered in fearful protest, steadied their glow, casting warm amber on Aaron's mud-splattered boots. In that moment, the council realized that compassion could turn a gruesome tableau into a quiet, almost tender, midnight lullaby. The following sunrise, the council convened beneath a sky the color of bruised grapes to rewrite the ancient burial code. They struck down the clause that demanded iron shackles, replacing it with a clause that praised gentle reverence and the sweet release of soil. Scribes, long accustomed to scratching iron ink on parchment, snickered that the new law sounded less like a death sentence and more like a spa brochure. The proclamation was read aloud, echoing off marble walls, while a chorus of rusted hinges clanged in protest, only to be silenced by the soft thump of a freshly dug grave. Ironically, the council's most fervent traditionalist muttered, "I guess we're not Iron Man after all," earning a reluctant chuckle from the entire assembly. With the shackles gone, Lyria's fields, once a barren expanse of wilted wheat and the occasional mournful howl, burst into verdant rebellion. Sunflowers rose like golden sentinels, their petals brushing the sky, while the scent of fresh loam tickled the nostrils of every passer-by. Children chased the wind, their laughter mingling with the low, contented moo of cattle that no longer shuffled in dread of phantom overseers. The air vibrated with the soft rustle of leaves, a soundtrack that made even the oldest stone statue seem to sway in a slow, approving groove. Even the village baker, famous for his crusty sourdough, claimed the rye tasted like victory seasoned with a dash of rebellion, and offered a free loaf to anyone who'd listen. The whole saga sealed a lesson sharper than any iron clasp. Fear should never dictate how the dead are honored. As the council elders bowed their heads, they recalled the old legend of the undying from a Netflix binge, where the undead were kept in closets because nobody could handle their emotional baggage. Here, however, the dead rested peacefully, as if they'd finally found a good Wi-Fi signal in the afterlife, streaming silence instead of static. The townsfolk erected a modest stone plaque, etched with a wink and the phrase, "Respect beats rust," so future generations would remember the absurdity of chaining spirits. The irony was palpable. Those who once feared the dead's bad vibes now cultivated gardens brighter than any superhero's cape. As dawn painted the hills in amber, a new chapter unfolded for the living, bright as a freshly frosted cupcake. Aaron stood at the edge of the field, boots muddy, eyes reflecting the sunrise, and whispered, "We've finally given them a proper send-off, not a prison break." The council, now more relaxed than a cat in a sunbeam, nodded and toasted with honey-sweet mead, their clinking cups sounding like tiny bells of approval. Lyria's people carried lanterns, their flames dancing like tiny galaxies, promising that every future burial would be a celebration, not a security drill. And somewhere, perhaps in the quiet beyond, a ghost smiled, finally free to enjoy the afterlife's version of a Netflix binge without interruptions. The valley of Eldermore lies cloaked in a permanent shawl of mist, the kind that makes you think the gods forgot to turn off the dryer. In its low, soggy hollows, Serf Myra kneels to the rhythm of the grindstone, her hands raw from coaxing life from a thin slice of earth. Overhead, Lord Harcourt sits in his stone tower like a bored cat, issuing edicts that sound like medieval fast food rules. Only his wheat may be milled, and any stray grain is a crime worthy of the gallows. The peasants shuffle beneath the Lord's banner, their shadows stretching long and thin, as if the day itself were trying to flee the scene. Yet beneath the silence, a thin crack in the feudal facade begins to echo like a bad karaoke rendition of a rebellion. The manor's pantry offers Myra's family a banquet of husks and turnips, the culinary equivalent of a dietitian's nightmare. The husks crackle under the fire like dry, whispering ghosts, sending a scent of burnt straw that clings to the wool of their cloaks. Turnips, swollen and knobby, sit in a wooden bowl, their earthy perfume thick enough to mask the sourness of the stale rye bread that never arrives. When Myra bites the tough, fibrous flesh, the crunch is a reminder that even the soil is trying to chew back. Still, the peasants grin through the grime, because in a world where you can't even steal a carrot, laughing at the Lord's absurdity is the only rebellion that doesn't get you beheaded. Beyond the high, ivy-tangled fence, the forbidden orchards sway like a smug, green billboard advertising, "Taste freedom, no tax." Apples blush red and gold, their perfume slicing through the fog like a neon sign in a medieval downtown. Myra watches the fruit swing in the wind, each sway a silent taunt from the gentry who hide behind their golden gauntlets while enjoying the very produce they deny the serfs. An old farmhand once whispered that the orchard belonged to the Lord, but only when he was in a particularly generous mood. Otherwise, it was a myth, like a unicorn that eats taxes. The irony isn't lost on Myra. She imagines the Lord, in his silk robes, snacking on a crisp apple while the peasants chew on turnip skins, a scene straight out of a sitcom about class warfare. Resentment simmers in Myra's chest like a pot of porridge left too long over the fire, bubbling, half-cooked, and threatening to spill over. She begins to steal a single, bruised apple at dusk, tucking it into the folds of her apron with the stealth of a cat burglar in a Disney cartoon. The sweet bite explodes, flooding her tongue with forbidden juice that tastes like triumph and a hint of rebellion's aftertaste. Word spreads faster than gossip about a new lute player, and soon other serfs are swapping husk crumbs for stolen fruit under the cover of moonlight. The manor's watchful eyes, however, are as blind as a medieval GPS. They can see the fields, not the tiny, crunchy acts of defiance sprouting in the shadows. Lord Harcourt, snug in his velvet armchair, will soon discover that even the most rigid feudal code can be hacked like an ancient computer, except the virus is a basket of apples. The peasants, now armed with pockets full of sweet loot, start humming an old tavern tune that sounds suspiciously like the opening bars of the Imperial March. A nod to any future tyrant who thinks he can silence a chorus of hungry mouths. As the mist lifts one morning, Myra stands on the ridge, a half-eaten apple in hand, and declares with the solemnity of a knight taking an oath, that the Lord's wheat will no longer be the only grain that feeds the heart. The Lord's men scramble, their swords clanging like spoons in a cafeteria, confused by the culinary mutiny. And somewhere beyond the fence, the orchard sways, as if cheering on the serfs with a rustle that sounds oddly like a round of applause. Myra slipped through the mud-splattered hedge like a thief in a medieval heist movie, the scent of damp earth and rotted straw choking the air. Her boots crunched over brittle twigs until she emerged into a sun-bleached clearing where ancient apple trees stood like armored sentries from a forgotten age. The apples glowed ruby red against the gray sky, their skin taut with juice that seemed to promise rebellion. A low buzz of insects swarmed the blossoms, a chorus louder than any court gossip. She could almost taste the forbidden sweetness before she even touched the bark. Guarding the orchard was the forester, a hulking man with a beard as tangled as the village's tax rolls and eyes that glittered like copper coins. He rattled his spear like a metronome, reciting the ruler's edict that fruit belonged only to lords who could afford silk-lined forks. The foreman's patrols stalked the perimeter, their boots thudding like drumbeats in a war march, while the villagers whispered that even the crows had been ordered to report stolen bites. Irony dripped from the scene. The very trees that once fed peasants now served as gilded trophies for the elite. Myra felt a shiver of both dread and exhilaration as the forester's shadow stretched over the orchard like a death sentence. Myra crouched behind a low oak, weighing her options as if she were negotiating a peace treaty with a dragon. The apples beckoned, their perfume a heady mix of honey and rebellion, and she imagined the sweet crunch echoing through the empty halls of the manor. She snatched a single fruit, its skin cracking under her fingertips, releasing a burst of fragrance that made the forester's dogs bark in confused fury. Every bite was a tiny mutiny, a juicy jab at the grain quotas that forced her family to survive on half a sack of barley. She knew the forester would soon catch wind of the theft, and the orchard would become a battlefield of wits and wilting fruit. The forester's patrol surged forward like a wave of angry peasants with pitchforks, snarling and brandishing whips that flicked the air with a sound like snapping twine. Myra darted between the trees, the leaves brushing her face with a hiss that sounded like a gossiping courtier. She could hear the distant clang of the village's grain store alarm, another quota deadline, a reminder that famine was a cruel overseer. In a daring move, she hurled an apple into the forester's path, the fruit bursting open and splattering sticky juice onto his steel boots, causing him to slip and scream like a cartoon knight. The chaos bought her precious seconds to disappear into the underbrush, the orchard's echoing silence swallowing the foreman's curses. Back in the cramped cottage, Myra shared the remnants of the stolen apple with her younger siblings, their faces lighting up like lanterns in a dark dungeon. The sweet flesh left a lingering sting of rebellion on their tongues, a reminder that even under brutal rules, humanity finds a way to savor small victories. She whispered a toast to the ancient trees, promising to return with more fruit and perhaps a new set of rules. Maybe even a karaoke night for the forester, because who wouldn't enjoy a medieval rendition of Eye of the Tiger? The grain quotas tightened, but the orchard's secret remained, a hidden garden of hope amid a world that measured worth in bushels. As the night settled, Myra fell asleep hearing the distant howl of wolves, thinking that even the wildest beasts respect a good apple. Word crackles through the village like smoke from a hearth, and by dusk the rumor has swollen into a full-blown legend. A secret banquet hidden in the ruined chapel on the hill. The locals whisper that the feasting table glitters with contraband cheese, hard enough to bite like a bone, and honey stolen from the Lord's hives, its amber dribble shimmering in candlelight. Smoked fish, its skin dark as a soot-blackened tunic, lies on rough wooden planks, sending a salty, fire-kissed scent wafting through the cracked stones. Even the wind seems to carry a whisper of rebellion, as if the very air is chewing on the forbidden feast. And just as the moon peeks out, a few daring peasants clutch their loot, ready to gamble with destiny. Myra, whose curiosity matches the size of the Lord's forbidden apple orchard, slips through the overgrown path with a basket on her arm, eyes glinting like the polished cut of a new butter knife. She steps into the chapel's shadowy nave and is hit by a mash of aromas: sharp cheese, sweet honey, and the briny bite of smoked fish that wrap around her like a greasy blanket. The crowd giggles, swapping stories and morsels as if they were trading Pokémon cards, while a fiddler shreds a jaunty tune that rattles the dust from ancient pews. Myra trades a handful of dried figs for a slice of cheese, feeling the gritty grit of centuries-old stone under her boots. The feast feels like a rebellion rehearsed in a Broadway rehearsal room, except the stage is a crumbling sanctuary, and the audience wears mud-splattered tunics. Just as Myra savors the cheese, a familiar voice slides in beside her. Old Joran, the cobbler who once mended her father's boots, now clutching a trembling flask of moonshine. He leans close, eyes darting, and whispers that the Lord's men are tracking the scent of smoke like bloodhounds sniffing a tavern brawl. With a sigh that sounds like a sack of grain spilling, Joran admits he sold the location to the enforcers for a promise of protection and a sack of fresh barley. Myra's heart drops faster than a dropped sack of apples, and the crowd freezes, the fiddler's bow hanging mid-air. The betrayal tastes sour, like honey gone bad, and the chapel's stones seem to tremble in anticipation of the coming storm. The night erupts as a thunderous clatter of armor boots beats against the chapel's stone floor, and the Lord's enforcers flood in like unwanted guests at a medieval wedding. Lanterns swing, casting grotesque shadows that dance over terrified faces and a spilled river of honey that now sticks boots to the floor. Joran, eyes wide with regret, tries to plead, but the captain snaps his gauntleted fingers, ordering men to seize every loaf, every wheel of cheese, and every smug grin. Screams mix with the squeak of wood as tables are overturned, and Myra finds herself handcuffed to a barrel of smoked fish, the oily smell clinging to her clothes like a guilty secret. By dawn, the chapel is a mess of broken pews, splintered dreams, and the metallic clang of keys locking the villagers in the Lord's grim cellar. The next morning, the village square is stripped of its prized apple stash, the one Myra had hidden beneath a false floorboard, hoping to barter for a better life. The Lord's men cart the crimson fruit away in a squeaky wooden wagon, its wheels whining like a disgruntled cartographer complaining about bad maps. Myra watches, her stomach empty and her spirit bruised, as the apples vanish into the Lord's pantry, a pantry as tight-fisted as a miser's purse. Yet among the wreckage, a few crumbs of cheese cling to a dented pot, and a single honeycomb drips slowly, reminding the survivors that even in defeat, sweetness can survive a siege. She swears to rebuild, to plan another banquet, and perhaps this time she'll invite the Lord's cat, because even a feline knows how to swipe a piece of forbidden fish. When the first frost clawed the thatched roofs of Harcourt's estates, Myra felt the gnaw of hunger like a wolf at her throat. The serfs whispered about the Lord's edicts: no berry beyond the fence, no pork for the poor, no grain unless the Lord said so, while the wind carried the sour stench of empty bowls. Myra, a wiry woman with eyes like polished iron, stared at the barren fields and imagined a banquet the size of a medieval Netflix binge. The day the Lord's men confiscated the barley she and her husband had coaxed from the soil, she swore the night would end with a feast, or at least a fight. Harcourt's food laws were as cruel as a medieval reality show, where the worst contestant got a spoonful of mud. The peasants were forbidden to taste the apples that dangled like ruby medals from the orchard trees, while the Lord's cooks savored them in gilded halls. The smell of smoked pork drifted down the hill, a tantalizing perfume that made stomachs churn and teeth chatter. Myra gathered the oppressed under the ancient oak, promising that the only thing they'd be denied from that day forward was the taste of sweet vengeance. With a voice that cracked like a wooden bucket, Myra rallied the serfs, her words rolling over the crowd like a drumbeat in a battle video game. Think Call of Duty, but with fewer explosions and more mud. She pointed to the granaries, hulking stone boxes that looked like the dead bodies of giants, stocked with wheat that had never felt a peasant's calloused hand. Laughter rose, half nervous, half defiant, as a frail old woman shouted, "If we can't eat the grain, we shall eat the guards." The crowd erupted, fists clenching, chanting a chorus that sounded like a choir of hungry banshees. At midnight, the rebels lunged toward the manor, the moon casting a silver sheen on the slick mud that squelched under their boots. The granary doors burst open with a deafening crash, exposing piles of golden wheat that glittered like treasure in an Indiana Jones tomb. Armored guards, their steel shining like a dishwasher's gleam, met the peasants with swords that sang a brutal lullaby. Blood sprayed, mingling with flour to create a gruesome, buttery white-red swirl as Myra swung a scythe, cutting through iron and oppression in one swift, sloppy arc. When dawn painted the sky a bruised purple, the granary stood half-ruined, its doors ajar, the air thick with the metallic tang of victory and the sweet aroma of freshly broken bread. The surviving guards, bruised and bewildered, slumped like overcooked sausages, while the serfs feasted on the very grain they'd been denied, slurping soup that tasted of freedom and sweat. Myra, cheeks smeared with ash and triumph, raised a crusty loaf like a trophy, winking at the sunrise as if to say, "You can lock the pantry, but you can't lock the hunger." The story of the revolt of the hungry would echo through taverns for generations, a reminder that even the most brutal food rules crumble under a belly full of resolve. The torches sputtered low as the rebels poured into the stone courtyard, their boots splashing through the mud that smelled of rot and last year's cider. The Lord, a gaunt man with a crown too heavy for his skull, raised a trembling hand and announced a grudging compromise that sounded as thin as stale bread. He would grudgingly grant the peasants a narrow lane into the orchard, a place where forbidden apples dangled like bright, red promises. Yet the deal came with a price: loyalty, whispered like a warning in the wind, and a share of the harvest that would be measured in shaky, hand-tuned scales. Myra stepped forward, her russet cloak fluttering like a banner of rebellion, and accepted the mantle of steward for the new communal fields. She ran her fingers over the freshly turned soil, feeling the gritty texture of hope mingling with the gritty grit of years of oppression. The field stretched out, a patchwork quilt of golden wheat and stubborn weeds, each stalk humming with the promise of a fairer feast. The crowd cheered, their voices cracking like crackling fire, as Myra declared the first collective sowing ceremony, a rite that felt as grand as a royal coronation, yet smelled of horse manure and fresh rain. From the orchard, a few privileged families clambered up the gnarled apple trees, their laughter echoing like a bad sitcom laugh track over the serious chatter of grain merchants. The fruit's perfume swirled with the sour tang of vinegar, a reminder of the old edicts that once barred anyone but the Lord from tasting such sweetness. The share of the harvest they received was measured in wooden buckets, each splashing with water that tasted of tears and spilled ale. Still, the people tasted the apples, their skin crisp and bruised, and for a fleeting moment the memory of brutal food laws, those that once made a peasant's belly ache for a crust, faded into the background. Hope sprouted like weeds in a neglected garden, stubborn and unapologetic. Myra organized communal feasts where the stew boiled over with carrots, turnips, and a pinch of rebellion, the broth bubbling like a cauldron of gossip. The peasants toasted with mugs of cider that fizzed like a pop culture meme. "I'm not a robot," etched on the foam, laughing as the old lord's guards stared, bewildered at the merriment. Irony hung heavy in the air, as the very laws that once dictated who could eat now served as the punchline of a joke told round the fire. Even as the night deepened, the scent of fresh earth and sweet fruit lingered, wrapping the settlement in a blanket of uneasy peace. The memory of the brutal food restrictions clung to the walls like soot, a reminder that compassion could be as fragile as a freshly baked crust. Yet Myra stood tall, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames, and promised a table where every seat was earned, not imposed. In the hush that followed, the future tasted both bitter and sweet, a banquet awaiting the next harvest, and the people, hungry for justice, chewed on it with fierce, hopeful mouths. The great hall of King Charles V swarmed like a beehive of silk and sighs, torchlight flickering against tapestries that smelled of wax and wet stone. Young Lady Elinor slipped between courtiers, her mind humming with a different tune. A wedding feast, a husband's hand, a bed of rose-laden linens. The clatter of horse hooves on cobblestones outside mingled with the soft rustle of linen skirts, painting a soundtrack of anticipation. Yet every glance at the mirrored armor reflected not just her own hopeful face, but the looming shadow of a new royal edict. In a dim corner, Master Rowan, the barber surgeon with a razor grin and a pouch of leeches, leaned close enough to taste the perfume of Elinor's rose water. He whispered about the king's latest decree, skin as pale as parchment, hair shaved to the crown like a freshly shaven head of a monk, and a corset so tight it could double as a siege weapon. The words scraped against the air like a scalpel, slicing through the court's usual chatter. Rowan's voice crackled with the same excitement a modern influencer shows, when unveiling a new, absurd beauty trend. Ladies of the court gasped, their giggles turning to whines as they imagined the cold sting of hair being pulled from roots, the ache of bone-crushing laces hugging their waists. Servants shuffled about, the scent of hot iron and boiled herbs filling the corridors as they prepared for a day of forced transformations. One noblewoman, draped in emerald velour, muttered that looking like a corpse was the new chic, while another muttered, I'd rather wrestle a dragon than wear that thing. The irony hung heavy. A kingdom that prized chivalry now demanded its women become living mannequins. Elinor felt a knot tighten in her stomach, tighter than any corset could possibly bind. She imagined herself on a stage, a medieval version of a reality show where the judges were kings and the prize was survival, not a rose. The sound of her own heartbeat matched the frantic thrum of a lute, each beat a reminder that this was no mere fashion. Her very flesh was at stake. Still, a spark of rebellion flickered. She glanced at Rowan, whose eyes gleamed like polished steel, wondering if the barber surgeon could be coaxed into a cut and run operation. As the royal herald bellowed the decree from the balcony, the courtyard erupted in a chorus of clanking metal and muffled curses. Women huddled, whispering strategies beneath the scent of burning tallow, while masters of the blade sharpened their tools with a grin that said, "I'm here for the drama." Elinor, clutching a hidden ribbon of silk, made a silent vow to turn the king's grotesque beauty rule into his own downfall. The stage was set, the mirrors ready, and the court would soon learn whether beauty truly kills, or if a clever lady can rewrite the script. Dawn cracked over the stone courtyard like a cracked egg, and Elinor was already perched on a cold iron stool, a rag of lead powder clutched in her trembling hand. The apothecary's apprentice dumped a glittering, metallic dust onto her cheek, the smell of wet pennies searing her nostrils as the powder sank like a grim moisturizer. Each swipe of the coarse cloth felt like a medieval exfoliant made for dragons, scraping away any hint of a youthful glow. The court's whispers turned into a chorus of muttered prayers for the king's health, while the powder left her skin the color of a freshly squeezed beet, an aesthetic that would make any Instagram filter jealous. Irony dripped from the rafters. The very lead meant to preserve beauty was slowly turning her skin into a living cautionary tale about toxicity. A plot twist even a Game of Thrones writer would applaud. When the powder dried, the maidens ushered in the next torture. Hair removal with a hot iron called the scarlet razor, its hiss echoing like a dragon's sigh. Elinor's arms trembled as the blade glided over her forearms, searing the flesh with a sensation that was part searing, part fireworks, and all very unwanted. The sound of other women's sighs rose in a grim chorus, each gasp a badge of loyalty to a king who measured devotion in the smoothness of his subjects' arms. The palace air grew thick with the coppery tang of burnt hair and the faint perfume of lavender, an olfactory joke that the scent was meant to mask the sting, not the misery. Even the court jester tried to lighten the mood, joking that the next fashion trend would be no hair, no problem. But his punchline fell flatter than a damp parchment. After the ritual, the dining hall offered a banquet of boiled herbs, a menu that could only be described as green soup meets swamp water. The broth bubbled sluggishly, releasing the earthy smell of nettles, dandelion roots, and a whisper of rosemary that tried desperately to masquerade as a culinary delight. Elinor ladled the viscous liquid into her mouth, feeling the grit of roots scrape her tongue like sandpaper on a medieval chalkboard. The other ladies sipped with forced smiles, their eyes darting toward the kitchen doorway as if a pizza delivery service might rescue them from this vegetal purgatory. A sudden rustle of parchment announced a new royal edict. "Thine waist shall be as thin as the king's patience," a phrase that would make even a modern health influencer cringe. Within the marble corridors, the court's ladies turned the torture chamber into a runway, each scar a glittering medal of devotion displayed like a medieval Instagram story. They whispered about the king's latest tryst with a traveling minstrel, trading gossip as if it were silk, while their fingers brushed the newly smooth skin of one another, comparing whose lead powder blush lasted longest. The ambience was thick with envy, rivalry, and the faint clink of armor as footmen shuffled past, their boots echoing like a metronome counting down each woman's chance at royal favor. A sudden burst of laughter erupted when one lady tried to hide a fresh scar under a veil, only for the king's favorite hound to sniff it out, proving that even dogs were better at reading the room than most courtiers. In that moment, the irony was as sharp as the razor. The very rituals meant to polish their images were carving deeper pits of jealousy beneath the gilded surface. Elinor, however, kept a secret rebellion tucked beneath the folds of her linen, tiny notes scribbled in charcoal, each a sigh of dissent against the crimson regime. She would slip them into the herb broth, letting the bitter taste carry her whispered protests like a covert code only the pantry rats could decode. The occasional chuckle from a passing servant hinted at a shared camaraderie, a covert network of those who found the king's beauty standards as absurd as a medieval meme. When the king entered the hall, his gaze sweeping over the smooth arms like a judge at a talent show, Elinor lifted her chin, feeling the faint sting of lead and the fierce pulse of defiance. In that brief instant, her scarred soul shone brighter than any powder-bleached cheek, proving that even in a world obsessed with superficial perfection, the human spirit could still flicker like a candle in a wind-blown cathedral. In the candle-swept gloom of St. Marek's chapel, Elinor slipped a lace-trimmed handkerchief into the cracked stone alcove, signaling the start of the clandestine council. Rowan, whose scarred hands once forged battle axes, lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that made the ancient frescoes seem to lean in. Around them gathered a handful of nobles with gaudy cloaks stained by blood wine, each clutching a parchment that listed the kingdom's grotesque beauty mandates, like the mandatory 6-hour fasting before a courtly feast. The air smelled of incense and damp moss, mingling with the metallic tang of fear. Even the stone seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls knew they were about to betray their sovereign's vanity. They plotted to expose the deadly standards that forced maidens to trim their hair with razors, and to swallow honey-scented poultices that turned their throats into rattling cages. Elinor sketched a caricature of the Queen's golden mask, a grotesque grin that would make a modern meme go viral in the tavern. Rowan suggested releasing the list of forbidden cosmetics at the upcoming midsummer tournament, where knights strutted like peacocks in polished armor that clanked louder than a heavy metal concert. The dissenters giggled, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceiling like a mischievous choir of gargoyles. Yet every chuckle was laced with the iron taste of impending peril, for they knew the king's spymaster listened to gossip like a raven to a midnight drum. Enter Lady Vivienne, whose jealousy burned brighter than the chapel's guttering candles. She coveted Rowan's favor and despised Elinor's daring smile. She slipped out of the shadows, her silk shoes clicking against the cold floor, and slipped a sealed note to the royal steward, detailing the conspirators' secret rendezvous. The note arrived wrapped in a fragrant rose, the scent of which clung to the steward's nostrils like a warning incense. By dawn, the royal guard stormed the chapel, their armor clanking like a marching band in a funeral procession. The shocked nobles froze, their faces flushing red as freshly painted banners, while the steward's quills scratched a terse decree on the town's notice board. The punishment was a public spectacle, staged on the stone square where the market's chatter usually danced with the smell of fresh bread. Elinor was forced to stand on a wooden platform, her hands bound with cords soaked in the same bitter herbal tincture that once beautified the queen, now repurposed as a torture device that made her skin crawl. Rowan watched, his heart hammering louder than a war drum, as a troop of drummers beat a rhythm that sounded like a dying horse's hooves. The crowd jeered, their voices a cacophony of glee and disgust, while the town crier shouted a chilling warning. "Defy the crown's beauty, and you shall taste the very ground you walk upon." The sun set, casting long shadows that stretched like skeletal fingers across the cobblestones. Even as the flames of the torches flickered, a low murmur rose from the corners of the square, whispers of defiance that refused to be snuffed out. Elinor, bruised but unbroken, managed a cracked smile that reminded onlookers of a meme face, half hopeful, half sarcastic. Rowan, though shackled, whispered a promise to his comrades that the next rebellion would be as inevitable as a sequel to a blockbuster franchise. The jealous lady, Vivienne, smirked, thinking she had won, yet she could not hear the soft rustle of parchment being hidden in the chapel's secret alcove, waiting for the next act. And so the tale of the brutal medieval beauty standards lingered, a grotesque legend told in hushed tones, like the bedtime story that keeps you awake. The royal tournament unfurled like a chaotic circus, banners snapping in the wind and trumpets blaring louder than a 2020s rave. King Aldrich, swaddled in a velvet cloak that smelled of pine resin and old money, barked an edict that made the squires wince, a public parade of the court's perfect women. He imagined a tableau as polished as a knight's armor, the kind of spectacle that would make even a medieval TikTok go viral. The courtyard swarmed with peasants, merchants, and drunk minstrels, all buzzing like bees around a honey-sweet promise of spectacle. When the king's herald shouted Elinor's name, the crowd peeled back their heads like startled geese. She stumbled onto the dais, skin a cracked parchment from relentless bleaching, so white it reflected the sun like a cracked mirror. Her hair, once a river of gold, now sat in a barren crown of sparse, straw-like strands, daring the sun to find a shade. The scent of burnt wax and chalk drifted around her, a fragrant reminder of the cruel alchemy that turned beauty into a public experiment. A collective gasp rose from the audience, half awe, half horror, as if they just witnessed a royal version of a reality show confession. Elinor lifted her cracked lips, voice trembling like a lute string, and shouted, "Your perfection is a poison, a cruel edict that strips us of flesh and spirit." Her words cracked the veneer of the king's court, echoing through the stone arches louder than a dragon's roar. Irony dripped from her declaration. She was the very embodiment of the absurd standards she condemned, like a medieval meme gone tragically literal. The murmurs erupted into a roar of anger, fists slammed against shields, and the scent of spilled ale mixed with the metallic tang of hastily drawn swords. Knights lunged forward, half to protect the king, half to quell the uprising, their armor clanking like a chorus of angry tin cans. Women in silk gowns whispered conspiracies, their eyes glittering with a mix of fear and fierce solidarity. The courtyard became a battlefield of ideology, where the fight for beauty turned into a literal fight for life, each shout reverberating like a war drum in a feudal rap battle. When the dust settled, the king sat on his throne, his crown askew, looking like a bewildered cat that had just been thrown into a room full of laser pointers. Elinor, bruised but unbowed, slipped away into the shadowed corridors, her silhouette a rebel flag against the drab stone walls. The court's whispers lingered, promising that the next decree would be less about porcelain faces and more about the grit under the nails. And somewhere, a minstrel began humming a new ballad, one that would be sung in taverns for years, reminding everyone that true beauty is as unruly and fierce as a runaway horse on a moonlit night. When the first cough rolled out of the market stalls like a bad whiff of sour butter, the kingdom's glittering beauty contests froze faster than a tavern's ale in a winter freeze. The once bright banners draped over the arena sagged, heavy with the smell of rot and damp wool, as whispers of the pestilence crept through the corridors. King Aldrich, who had once judged maidens on the length of their lashes and the sheen of their hair, clutched his jeweled goblet as if the wine could ward off death. Courtiers tried to hide their panic behind forced chuckles, but the sound of coughing echoing off stone walls was louder than any lute. In that moment, the kingdom's obsession with hollow beauty was forced into a silent, uneasy truce with mortality. The king retreated to his chambers, where candlelight flickered against tapestries depicting mythic queens, each more flawless than a Photoshop filter. He stared at the scarred faces of his physicians, the air thick with incense trying to mask the metallic tang of blood, and wondered if his cruel rules were more a joke than a decree. With a sigh that rattled his crown, Aldrich ordered the judges' blades, those cruel instruments that measured cheekbones with knives, to be sheathed, like a weapon left idle after a showdown in a Marvel movie. The court stone floors, once polished to mirror shine, now echoed the soft thuds of worn boots, a reminder that even monarchs must bow to the grim reaper's timetable. Ironically, the kingdom's most brutal standards were abandoned quieter than a secret Snapchat streak disappearing. Elinor, the once favored contestant whose skin bore the gold-leafed markings of the king's vanity, survived the plague with a complexion marred by feverish rashes and a jagged scar across her cheek. The scar, a bright slash of crimson against pale flesh, smelled faintly of burnt resin each time she brushed her hand over it, a tactile reminder of the battle she'd endured. Yet rather than hide it, she wore it like a badge, her laughter ringing louder than the coughing crowds, turning the wound into a rallying flag for those who'd grown tired of perfection. People began to whisper that her scar glittered like the lightsaber of a certain space-faring Jedi, cutting through the darkness of oppression. In taverns, songs rose about Elinor's resilience, and the clink of mugs echoed the rhythm of a new, grittier beauty. Gradually, the court's atmosphere softened. The once stifling perfume of rosewater was replaced by the earthy scent of fresh bread and pine needles, symbols of a more humane kingdom. Courtiers swapped cruel critiques for genuine compliments, noting the strength in a calloused hand or the kindness in a warm smile, as if they were rating characters on a reality TV show where vulnerability earned points. King Aldrich, now pale but wiser, announced that future contests would celebrate the spirit that survives the night, a phrase that smelled oddly like burnt sage and hope. The old brutal rules lay in a dusty cupboard, their metal edges dulled like an obsolete gaming controller, forgotten by those who once wielded them. The memory of Elian's defiance lingered, a ghostly echo that turned the palace halls from a catwalk into a cathedral of lived experience. Years later, when a minstrel strummed a lute and sang of the plague that turned a kingdom's vanity on its head, listeners laughed and cried in equal measure, their eyes glistening like the wet cobblestones after a rainstorm. The story became a cautionary tale, whispered to children who dared to obsess over flawless skin, reminding them that true beauty can be as messy as a battlefield in Game of Thrones, but far less dramatic in costuming. Even the king's portrait was repainted, now showing him with a slightly crooked grin and a faint smudge of ink on his cheek, as if he'd just survived a terrible meme. The court, once a runway of cruelty, blossomed into a garden where scarred roses grew beside pristine lilies, each scent mingling in a fragrant rebellion against the past. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the palace, Elinor's scar still glowed, a stubborn reminder that sometimes the most brutal rules break themselves without a single sword swing.